Number 1. Dennis Rader, the church president who bound, tortured, and killed 10 people while his community never once suspected a thing. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the eldest of 4 brothers raised in a working-class household by parents who were described by neighbors as decent, hardworking, and entirely unremarkable. From the outside, the Rader family appeared to be everything a mid-century American family was supposed to be: church-going, modest, and rooted in the kind of quiet Midwestern values that made Wichita, Kansas the sort of place where people left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors without question. Dennis grew up in that environment, attended school, held jobs, served in the United States Air Force between 1966 and 1970, married a woman named Paula Dietz in 1971, had 2 children, and eventually settled into the kind of suburban domesticity that made him all but invisible to the world around him. He was a church president at Christ Lutheran Church, a Cub Scout leader, a compliance officer for the city of Park City, Kansas, and a man who spent his weekends mowing his lawn and attending services. He was, by every external measure, the last person anyone would ever suspect of being one of the most methodical and sadistic serial killers in American history, a man who had spent the better part of 3 decades hunting, stalking, binding, torturing, and murdering 10 innocent people while hiding behind the most ordinary life imaginable, a man who gave himself a name that he was desperate for the world to know, BA, which stood for bind, torture, kill, and who taunted police and journalists with letters and packages for years, daring them to catch him while he sat in the pews of his church and shook hands with his congregation every Sunday morning as though the blood on his hands had never existed at all. The first murders happened on January 15, 1974, and they were not the work of a man still finding his way into darkness. They were the work of someone who had already been living in it for years. Rader had been fantasizing about killing since childhood, nurturing what he would later describe as a factor inside him, a dark and consuming compulsion that he could not explain and did not try to resist. He had tortured animals, stolen women's underwear from clotheslines, developed elaborate bondage fantasies, and spent years identifying potential victims in the Wichita area before he ever acted on any of it. When he finally did act, he chose the Otero family, Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, and 2 of their 5 children, 9-year-old Joseph II and 11-year-old Josephine, and he did so with a coldness that investigators would later describe as almost incomprehensible. Rader had cut the phone line to the house before entering, confronted the family inside, and systematically bound and killed each member one by one. Joseph Otero was strangled with a cord. Julie Otero was suffocated with a plastic bag placed over her head. Young Joseph II was also suffocated. And Josephine, the 11-year-old girl, was taken to the basement, where Rader hanged her from a pipe and sexually assaulted her as she died. He then left the house, drove away, and went about his day. 3 of the surviving Otero children came home from school to find their parents and siblings dead. The horror of that afternoon was beyond description, and yet what made it even more unbearable in retrospect was the knowledge that the man responsible had not panicked, had not fled the state, had not even significantly altered his routine. He had simply gone on living his life in Wichita as though nothing had happened at all. The killings continued. On April 4, 1974, just months after the Otero murders, Rader broke into the home of 21-year-old Catherine Bright and waited for her to return. Her brother Kevin arrived with her, which was not part of Rader's plan, and when Rader attempted to strangle Kevin, the young man fought back with extraordinary ferocity, breaking free twice even after being shot. Kevin Bright survived, though he was left with devastating injuries. Catherine was not as fortunate. Rader stabbed her multiple times and left her dying on the floor of her own home. She was pronounced dead at the hospital. Rader had been interrupted, his fantasy incomplete, and investigators noted later that this frustration seemed to fuel rather than deter him. He went quiet for 3 years after Catherine Bright's murder, but the silence was not reform, it was patience. In March 1977, he murdered Shirley Vian, a 24-year-old mother of 3 who was sick in bed when Rader arrived at her home. He locked her young children in the bathroom so they would not witness what he did to their mother, and then he strangled Shirley Vian with a cord while her children pounded on the bathroom door and screamed for her. 9 months later, In December 1977, he killed Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old woman he had been stalking for weeks. After murdering her, he drove to a gas station and used the payphone to call the police and report the body himself, an act of such audacious psychological control that it became one of the defining moments investigators would later point to when trying to explain exactly who and what Dennis Rader was. Between murders, Rader did something that most killers never do. He communicated. He wrote letters. He sent packages. He reached out to newspapers and to the police with detailed, often grammatically chaotic messages in which he described his crimes, coined his own nickname, and demanded recognition. In October 1974, a letter was found in a book at the Wichita Public Library in which Rader took credit for the Otero murders, described them in graphic detail, and introduced himself to the world as BTK. He sent poems. He sent word puzzles. He created what he called projects, elaborate fantasy scenarios involving specific victims that he had identified and was planning to kill. He craved attention with a desperation that was almost pitiable in its nakedness, and yet for years the attention he received was directed at a faceless monster, a shadow, a set of initials, not at the man in the pew, the man with the badge, the man at the school meeting. The disconnect between his public identity and his private compulsions was so vast that even the people closest to him registered nothing. His wife Paula would later say that she had no idea, that she had lived beside this man for decades and seen nothing that prepared her for the truth. His children said the same. His congregation said the same. Everyone said the same, and every one of them meant it. The murders did not stop with Nancy Fox. In April 1979, Rader targeted a woman named Anna Williams, broke into her home, and waited for hours for her to return, but she never came home that night, having stayed at a relative's house, and Rader eventually left. He was so enraged by this failure that he wrote Anna Williams a poem and sent it to her, a document so disturbing in its specificity that it confirmed to investigators that whoever BTK was, he had been inside her home. Anna Williams moved away from Wichita shortly after. In 1985, Rader murdered Maureen Hedge, a 62-year-old woman who lived just a few houses away from him on his own street. He strangled her, moved her body, photographed it in various staged positions satisfying his fantasy, and then disposed of her remains. In 1986, he killed Vicki Wegerle, a 28-year-old woman, by gaining entry to her home under false pretenses and strangling her while her 2-year-old son was in another room. And in 1991, he committed what would turn out to be his final murder, that of Dolores Davis, a 62-year-old woman he strangled in her own home and whose body he left under a bridge. After Dolores Davis, Rader went silent for more than a decade, and investigators began to wonder whether BTK had died, moved away, or simply stopped. None of them considered the possibility that he had merely become more comfortable in the life he had constructed around himself. The silence broke in 2004. Wichita was marking the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, and local media coverage of the case apparently triggered something in Rader that he could not contain. He began sending communications again, to television stations, to newspapers, to the police, and the communications were more elaborate than ever. He sent packages containing driver's licenses taken from his victims, jewelry, drawings, and written descriptions of his crimes that were chilling in their detail and their pride. Investigators scrambled to analyze every communication for forensic clues, and the task force dedicated to the BTK case grew significantly in size and urgency. Rader seemed to be enjoying every moment of it. He asked investigators, through one of his letters, whether a floppy disk could be traced back to him if he used it to send a message. The investigators, in what became one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the case, responded through a newspaper classified ad that a floppy disk could not be traced. It was not true. On February 16, 2005, Rader sent a purple floppy disk to a local television station. Forensic analysts examined the disk's metadata and found a deleted document that had been created by someone named Dennis and last modified at Christ Lutheran Church. Within days, investigators had identified Dennis Rader, the church president, the compliance officer, the Cub Scout leader, and within weeks they had gathered enough evidence through surveillance, DNA comparison using a sample obtained from his daughter, and document analysis to be certain beyond any doubt that Dennis Rader and BTK were the same person. He was arrested on February 25, 2005, pulled over in his car near his home in Park City. The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic. There was no chase, no confrontation, no dramatic standoff. Rader was simply stopped, handcuffed, and taken into custody, and the man who had spent 30 years building the most elaborate double life in the history of American crime was finally, irreversibly, exposed. The news spread through Wichita with a speed and a force that the city had rarely experienced. People who had known Rader for years, neighbors, fellow churchgoers, co-workers, the families of his Boy Scout troop, described a disorientation so profound that many of them struggled to articulate it. This was not a stranger. This was not a shadowy figure from the margins of society. This was Dennis. This was the man who had written them up for code violations and attended their children's baptisms and stood at the front of their church with a hymnal in his hands. The cognitive dissonance was almost impossible to process, and for many people in Wichita, it never fully resolved. The legal proceedings moved with unusual swiftness given the scale and complexity of the case. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, and in June 2005, he appeared in court and entered guilty pleas to all 10 charges. What followed over the course of several days was one of the most disturbing courtroom spectacles in American legal history. Rader stood at the podium and described his crimes in methodical, almost clinical detail, occasionally using the language of his own bizarre internal mythology, referring to his victims as projects, and describing the process of their murders with a detachment that made observers physically ill. He showed no remorse. He showed, instead, a kind of satisfaction, as though the courtroom were finally giving him the audience he had always believed he deserved. Judge Gregory Waller, who presided over the sentencing, imposed 10 consecutive life sentences, the maximum possible under Kansas law since the murders had all occurred before the state reinstated the death penalty in 1994. Rader would never be eligible for parole. He was taken to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains to this day, aging in a cell while the families of his 10 victims continue to live with the consequences of what he did to them and to the people they loved. The BTK case left a mark on Wichita that goes far beyond the statistics of a criminal investigation. It forced a community to confront the deeply uncomfortable truth that the most dangerous people are not always the ones who look dangerous, that evil does not announce itself, that it can wear a compliance officer's uniform and a church president's smile and sit beside you at services for 20 years while carrying the weight of 10 murders and the memory of the suffering it caused. Dennis Rader's victims, Julie and Joseph Otero, and their children, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicki Wegerle, and Dolores Davis, were ordinary people living ordinary lives, and they were chosen not because of anything they did but because they were accessible to a man who had decided that his fantasies mattered more than their lives. The investigation that eventually caught him was a testament to the persistence of the detectives who never stopped working the case even when the trail went cold for years, and to the families of the victims who never stopped demanding that the world remember their loved ones as people rather than as entries in a case file. Dennis Rader wanted to be remembered as BTK, as a figure of terror and notoriety, as someone whose name would be spoken with fear for generations. What he is instead is a cautionary tale about the capacity for concealment that exists in human beings, about the danger of assuming that familiarity equals safety, and about the 10 people whose names should always be spoken before his: Joseph, Julie, Josephine, Joseph II, Catherine, Shirley, Nancy, Maureen, Vicki, and Dolores, each of whom deserved to live a full and uninterrupted life, and none of whom ever got the chance. Number 2, John List, the accountant who murdered his entire family, vanished without a trace, and built a brand new life for 18 years while the world searched for him everywhere. John Emil List was born on September 17, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan, into a household shaped by rigid Lutheran faith, strict discipline, and an emotional coldness that would define him for the rest of his life. His parents, John and Alma List, were devout and exacting people who raised their son to believe that appearances mattered above all else, that financial stability was a moral obligation, and that failure of any kind was not simply an inconvenience but a reflection of one's character and one's standing before God. John List grew up quiet, obedient, and deeply uncomfortable with confrontation of any kind, a boy who internalized everything, who processed his anxieties privately and presented the world with a composed, unremarkable exterior that gave no indication of the turmoil beneath it. He was not popular in school, not athletic, not particularly social, but he was diligent and precise, the kind of student who did exactly what was required of him and nothing more. He served in the United States Army during World War II and again during the Korean War, reaching the rank of first lieutenant, and when he returned to civilian life he pursued a degree in business administration and then a master's degree in accounting from the University of Michigan, credentials that he wore with a quiet pride that was perhaps the closest thing to genuine emotion that the people around him ever witnessed from him. He married Helen Morris Taylor in 1951, a widow with a daughter named Brenda from her first marriage, and together they had 3 more children, Patricia, Frederick, and John Frederick List, known as Johnny. From the outside, the List family appeared to be exactly what post-war American society celebrated: educated, church-going, financially ambitious, and settled in the comfortable suburbs of New Jersey where respectability was measured in lawn care and church attendance and the kind of steady employment that signaled a man was fulfilling his proper role in the world. The reality inside the List household was considerably darker than the image projected to the neighborhood. Helen List had contracted syphilis from her first husband before his death, and the disease, left inadequately treated, had progressed over the years to affect her neurological functioning, leaving her increasingly erratic, difficult to manage, and prone to behavior that embarrassed her husband profoundly. She drank. She argued. She was, in John List's estimation, a source of shame and disorder in a life that he had constructed around the avoidance of both. His mother Alma, who was elderly and nearly blind, lived in a separate apartment on the top floor of the family's large Victorian home at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey, a house that List had purchased in 1965 for a price that was almost immediately beyond his means. The house was called Breeze Knoll, and it was in many ways the central symbol of everything that was wrong with John List's life. It was a monument to the image he wanted to project rather than the reality he could afford, a sprawling 18-room mansion that required constant maintenance and consumed money at a rate that List could not sustain. His career, which had seemed promising, had been faltering for years. He had lost a banking job in New Jersey and struggled to find stable employment afterward, eventually taking a position as an accountant that paid far less than he needed to maintain the lifestyle he had constructed. He had been secretly draining his mother's savings account to cover the family's expenses, a fact he concealed from everyone, and by the autumn of 1971 the financial situation had become so desperate that foreclosure on Breeze Knoll was essentially inevitable. John List was running out of time, running out of money, and running out of the ability to maintain the fiction that everything was fine. What happened next was the product of a mind that had spent decades refusing to confront difficulty directly and had finally arrived at the most monstrous possible conclusion about what it meant to protect one's family from shame. List would later claim, with an earnestness that investigators and psychiatrists found both genuine and horrifying, that he had killed his family out of love, that he had been concerned about the effect that financial ruin and social disgrace would have on his wife and children, and that he had decided it was better to send them to heaven than to allow them to suffer through the humiliation of poverty and failure. He worried specifically about his daughter Patricia, who had become involved in drama and the arts and had expressed an interest in acting, a profession that List associated with moral corruption and spiritual danger. He worried about his son Frederick, who had been getting into trouble at school. He worried about Helen, whose drinking and deteriorating health he believed made her spiritually vulnerable. And so, operating from within a framework of religious delusion and psychological rigidity so profound that it had completely severed his capacity for normal moral reasoning, John List sat down and planned the murder of every member of his family with the same methodical precision he applied to his accounting work. On the morning of November 9, 1971, John List rose early, as was his habit, and he began. He shot his wife Helen in the back of the head in the kitchen while she was having her morning coffee, killing her almost instantly. He then climbed the stairs to the top-floor apartment where his mother Alma lived and shot her in the left eye, killing her as well. He came back downstairs, dragged Helen's body to the ballroom, and placed it on a sleeping bag he had laid out on the floor. He could not carry his mother's body down the stairs due to her weight, so he left her where she had fallen. He then went about his day with a composure that defies ordinary comprehension. He ate breakfast, attended to some paperwork, and waited for his children to come home from school. When his daughter Patricia arrived home in the afternoon, he shot her in the back of the head as she entered the house. When his son Frederick arrived, he shot him as well, though Frederick did not die immediately and List shot him several more times to ensure his death. When his youngest child Johnny came home from school, List shot him too. He placed the bodies of his wife and children on sleeping bags in the ballroom in a row, with their arms folded, and he turned on every light in the house. He had already, in the days before the murders, arranged for the mail and newspaper deliveries to be stopped, notified his children's schools that the family would be taking an extended vacation, and written letters to his pastor and to family members explaining, in the most banal and bureaucratic language imaginable, that he had done what he had done and that he hoped God would forgive him. He left those letters on his desk. He then got in his car and drove away, and John List disappeared. The discovery of the bodies came nearly a month later, on December 7, 1971, when a neighbor noticed that the lights in Breeze Knoll had been burning continuously for weeks and that no one had been seen coming or going. Police entered the house and found what one investigator described as one of the most disturbing crime scenes he had ever encountered: 5 bodies in various states of decomposition laid out with a terrible neatness in the ballroom of an enormous, decaying Victorian house. The lights blazing in every room, classical music still playing softly from the intercom system that List had switched on before he left. The letters he had written were found on his desk. His car was discovered at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. And John List himself was nowhere to be found. The case became immediately notorious. It was covered extensively by newspapers across the country, featured on television news programs, and discussed in law enforcement circles as one of the most calculated and deliberate family annihilations in American criminal history. But despite the notoriety, despite the coverage, despite the letters List had left behind that explained everything except where he had gone, investigators could not find him. He had vanished as completely and as deliberately as he had done everything else in his life, and the trail went cold almost immediately. What John List did after leaving Westfield, New Jersey, was in many ways as remarkable as the crime itself, though remarkable in a way that speaks to the profound ordinariness of the man rather than to any particular cunning. He did not flee to a foreign country. He did not construct an elaborate disguise. He did not fundamentally alter who he was or how he lived. He traveled to Colorado, where he eventually assumed the identity of Robert Peter Clark, obtained fraudulent documents, and began rebuilding exactly the same kind of life he had destroyed. He found work as an accountant. He joined a Lutheran church. He became active in his congregation, taught Sunday school, and was regarded by everyone who knew him as a quiet, dependable, deeply religious man of impeccable character. He eventually moved to Richmond, Virginia, where he met a widow named Dolores Miller through a church singles group, and in 1985, 14 years after murdering his entire family, John List married again. He and Dolores settled into a modest home in the Richmond suburb of Midlothian, where he worked as an accountant, attended church regularly, and was known to his neighbors as Bob Clark, a pleasant, somewhat reserved man who kept to himself but was always polite and who seemed, by all appearances, to be exactly what he presented himself as. No one who knew him in those years had any reason to suspect that Bob Clark was anything other than what he appeared to be, and the thought that the quiet accountant in the pew beside them was a man wanted for the murder of 5 members of his own family never crossed anyone's mind. The break in the case came not from traditional investigative work but from a television program. In May 1989, the popular American true crime show America's Most Wanted featured the John List case in a segment that included a remarkable innovation. A forensic sculptor named Frank Bender had been commissioned to create an age-progressed bust of what John List might look like nearly 18 years after the murders, taking into account the natural aging process and the physical changes that time typically produces in a man of his background and build. The bust was displayed on television, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days of the broadcast, investigators received a tip from a woman in Richmond, Virginia, named Wanda Flannery, a neighbor of Robert and Dolores Clark, who told investigators that the bust on the television screen looked exactly like her neighbor Bob Clark. She was not certain. She was not even particularly insistent. But she was specific enough, and the tip was credible enough, that investigators in New Jersey coordinated with authorities in Virginia to look into Robert Clark's background. What they found, when they began pulling at the threads of Clark's documented history, was a life that began in 1972 with no prior paper trail whatsoever, no birth records, no school records, no military service records, nothing that predated the moment John List had ceased to exist and Robert Clark had taken his place. John List was arrested on June 1, 1989, at the accounting firm where he worked in Richmond, Virginia. He was 63 years old. When investigators approached him and told him he was being taken into custody in connection with the murders of his family in Westfield, New Jersey, his response was almost eerily consistent with everything that had come before. He did not panic, did not attempt to flee, did not express any dramatic emotion. He asked quietly whether he could call his wife. The investigation that followed his arrest was thorough but relatively uncomplicated, since List had essentially confessed in the letters he left behind 18 years earlier. The physical evidence, while degraded by time, was sufficient, and the letters themselves remained among the most damning pieces of documentation in the history of American criminal prosecution, written in List's own hand, in his own voice, explaining in the language of a man who genuinely believed he had done the right thing exactly what he had done and why he had done it. His wife Dolores, who had known him as Bob Clark and had married him in good faith, was devastated by the revelation in a way that observers noted seemed almost as cruel in its own way as anything else connected to the case. She had loved a man who did not exist, had built a life with a ghost, and now watched as everything she thought she knew dissolved around her. The trial of John List took place in April and May of 1990 in Union County, New Jersey. His defense attorneys argued that List had been suffering from a severe mental illness at the time of the murders, that his actions had been the product of a delusional religious framework so distorted as to constitute legal insanity. Psychiatric experts testified at length about List's psychology, about his rigidity, his inability to process failure, his distorted application of Lutheran theology to justify the unjustifiable, and there was genuine clinical substance to much of what they said. But the jury was not persuaded that what List had done qualified as the product of a mind so diseased as to be legally insane. They deliberated for relatively briefly and returned verdicts of guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. Judge William Wertheimer sentenced John List to 5 consecutive terms of life imprisonment, which under New Jersey law at the time meant that he would never be released. List showed the same composed, affectless response to his sentencing that he had shown to virtually everything else in the legal proceedings. He thanked the judge, sat down quietly, and was taken away. He was incarcerated at the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, where he lived out the remainder of his life in a manner that, by all accounts, continued to reflect the same orderly, religious routine he had maintained throughout his entire existence. He gave occasional interviews over the years, in which he continued to insist that he had acted out of love and concern for his family, and he never demonstrated anything that observers recognized as genuine remorse for the 5 lives he had taken. John List died in prison on March 21, 2008, at the age of 82, of complications from pneumonia. The List case endures as one of the most studied and discussed family annihilation cases in American criminological history. Not because of its gore or its sensationalism, it has relatively little of either, but because of what it reveals about the intersection of psychological rigidity, financial shame, religious distortion, and the catastrophic consequences of a mind that has never learned to cope with failure in any healthy way. John List did not kill his family in a moment of rage or passion. He planned it carefully, executed it methodically, cleaned up afterward, arranged the bodies with a terrible consideration, turned on the lights and the music, wrote his letters, and drove away. And then he lived for 18 more years in the same way he had always lived, going to church and doing his accounting and being a good neighbor, as though the ballroom at Breeze Knoll had never existed. The 5 people he killed, Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and Johnny were not abstractions or symbols in some theological equation. They were a mother who struggled with illness, an elderly woman who had raised her son and trusted him, a teenage girl with dreams of performing, a boy who was finding his way through adolescence, and a child who came home from school one afternoon and never saw another morning. Their lives mattered, and the ease with which John List erased them and then erased himself is perhaps the most disturbing thing about a case that offers no shortage of disturbing things to contemplate. Number 3. Chris Watts, the devoted husband and father who smiled for the cameras, pleaded for his family's safe return, and had already buried them in an oil field before the search ever began. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16, 1985, in Spring Lake, North Carolina, and by every measure that the people around him could apply, he grew up to be exactly the kind of man that his community celebrated and his family adored. He was quiet, agreeable, physically fit, and seemingly devoted to the life he had built, a life that included a comfortable home in the suburbs of Frederick, Colorado, a steady job as an operator for the Anadarko Petroleum Corporation, and a marriage to a woman named Sean and Catherine Rizuki, whom he had met in 2010 and married in 2012, and with whom he had 2 daughters, Bella Marie Watts, who was 4 years old in the summer of 2018, and Celeste Catherine Watts, who was 3. Sean Ann was 15 weeks pregnant with their 3rd child, a boy they had already named Nico, when Chris Watts murdered all 3 of them in the early morning hours of August 13, 2018, disposed of their bodies at a remote oil work site operated by his employer, and then stood in front of television cameras in his driveway and pleaded, with what appeared to the watching world to be genuine anguish and desperation, for their safe return. He hugged neighbors. He thanked the community for their support. He spoke about his daughters with a trembling voice and watering eyes, and the people who watched him, in person and through their television screens, saw a man destroyed by grief and fear. What they were actually watching was a man who had already driven his pregnant wife's body to an oil field, submerged her in a crude oil tank, and buried his 2 small daughters in the earth beside it, and who was now performing the role of devastated husband and father with a facility that left even experienced investigators momentarily uncertain about what they were dealing with. The marriage between Chris and Sean and Watts had never been as stable as it appeared from the outside, though the instabilities were largely invisible to the friends and family members who followed Shanann's enthusiastic and prolific social media presence. Sean Ann was a vibrant, outgoing woman who documented her family's life extensively on Facebook and Instagram, sharing videos of her daughters, her home, her work promoting a multi-level marketing health and wellness company called Thrive, and her relationship with Chris with a warmth and openness that earned her thousands of followers and painted a picture of a happy, busy, loving family. What the social media posts did not capture, because Sean Ann herself may not have fully understood the depth of it, was the degree to which Chris Watts had become emotionally disengaged from his marriage and his family in the months leading up to the murders. He had been having an affair since the late spring of 2018 with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger, a relationship that had rapidly become consuming and that had led Watts, in the private recesses of his own psychology, to begin thinking of his wife and daughters not as the people he loved but as obstacles, as complications standing between him and the new life he had decided he wanted. Nicole Kessinger was aware that Watts was married but believed, based on what he told her, that he and Sean Ann were already in the process of separating. She did not know about the pregnancy. She did not know much of what was actually happening inside the Watts household, because Chris Watts was telling her what he needed her to believe, just as he was telling Sean Ann what he needed her to believe, and just as he would tell the cameras and the investigators and the world what he needed them to believe in the days that followed the murders. Sean Ann had been away from home for several weeks in the summer of 2018, visiting family in North Carolina with the girls, and the separation had given Watts and Kessinger an unusual amount of time together, time that had accelerated the intensity of the affair and deepened Watts's conviction that he wanted out of his marriage. When Sean Ann returned to Frederick in the early morning hours of August 13, 2018, arriving home from a work trip to Arizona at approximately 1:48 in the morning, the dynamic she walked back into was one that her husband had already, in his own mind, resolved. Exactly what transpired in the hours between her return and the murders is known partly from Watts's own admissions, which evolved significantly over time as he gave multiple conflicting accounts to investigators, and partly from the forensic evidence gathered at the scene. What is established is that at some point in the early morning hours, while their daughters slept in their rooms, Chris Watts strangled Sean and Watts to death in their bed. He then went to the girls' rooms and murdered Bella and Celeste as well, smothering them, and he loaded all 3 bodies into his work truck before the sun came up. He drove approximately 40 miles to the Survey 319 oil work site where he was employed, and there he disposed of his family in a manner so cold and so calculated that the investigators who eventually reconstructed the sequence of events struggled to find language adequate to describe it. He buried Bella and Celeste in shallow graves in the earth near the oil tanks. He lifted the metal hatch of one of the crude oil storage tanks and lowered Shanann's body into it, submerging her in the thick, dark liquid. He then drove back to Frederick, got his daughter's car seats out of his truck and put them in the garage, and waited for the day to begin. The alarm was raised by a friend and colleague of Shanann's named Nicole Atkinson, who had been expecting Shanann to attend a doctor's appointment that morning and became increasingly alarmed when Shanann failed to appear and stopped responding to calls and messages. Nicole went to the Watts home, knocked on the door, and when Chris Watts answered, she noted immediately that something about his demeanor seemed wrong, not obviously wrong, not dramatically wrong, but wrong in the way that only someone paying very close attention would notice, a flatness, an absence of the alarm that a husband should be feeling when his pregnant wife has not answered her phone for hours. Nicole contacted the police, and officers arrived at the home and spoke with Watts, who told them that he and Shanann had argued that morning about the state of their marriage and that she had left with the girls. He did not know where they had gone, he said. He was worried, he said. He wanted to find them, he said. The officers noted that his effect seemed unusual but had no immediate grounds for treating him as anything other than a concerned husband, and the case was opened as a missing persons investigation. Within hours, however, the investigation had intensified dramatically. The television appearance, which was broadcast on the morning of August 14, 2018, became one of the most analyzed pieces of footage in the history of true crime media. Watts stood in his driveway and spoke to a reporter from Denver's KMGH television station, and what viewers saw was a man apparently consumed by worry and love, a man who spoke about his daughters with a tenderness that seemed real, who said that he wanted his family back and that he hoped wherever they were safe. Behavioral analysts and investigators who later reviewed the footage noted numerous indicators that Watts's emotional displays were manufactured rather than genuine. The tears that appeared without the physiological signs that accompany real crying, the specific language he used when speaking about Sean and compared to when he spoke about the girls, the moments of apparent calm that surfaced between expressions of distress. But in the moment, to the casual viewer, he was simply a frightened husband and father, and the sympathy directed at him in the hours following the broadcast was substantial. It did not last long. Investigators, working with unprecedented speed, had already begun constructing a picture of the Watts marriage that did not match the devoted family man on the screen, had already identified Nicole Kessinger through examination of Watts's phone records, and had already determined that the Survey 319 oil site was one of the locations Watts had visited on the morning of August 13. On August 15, 2018, just 2 days after Shanann's return home and the murders, investigators confronted Chris Watts at the Frederick Police Department with what they knew, and the confrontation produced one of the most extraordinary moments in the entire case. Watts, sitting across from investigators in an interview room, initially continued to maintain that Shanann had left voluntarily with the girls. But when investigators told him, in carefully chosen terms, that they had information suggesting something very different had happened, Watts underwent a visible and dramatic shift. He began to cry, genuinely this time, in the assessment of the investigators present, and he offered an account of events that was both a confession and an attempt to redirect blame. He told investigators that he had discovered Shanann strangling Celeste in their bedroom, that he had attacked Shanann in a rage, and that Bella had already been killed by Shanann before he intervened. It was a story that was almost immediately identified as false by the forensic evidence. The physical evidence was entirely inconsistent with Shanann having harmed the children, but it was the account Watts gave in that initial interrogation, and it was the account that led investigators directly to the Survey 319 site, where the bodies of Bella, Celeste, and Sean were recovered on August 16, 2018. The recovery of the bodies was conducted with an agonizing care and thoroughness that reflected both the professionalism of the investigators and the sheer horror of what they were doing, retrieving the remains of 2 small children from the ground and the body of a pregnant woman from a tank of crude oil, in the summer heat of a Colorado oil field, while the man who had put them there sat in a holding facility and waited to see what would happen next. Chris Watts was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, including the murders of Sean, Bella, and Celeste, as well as the unlawful termination of a pregnancy for the death of the unborn child Nico. He was also charged with 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The case attracted international media attention at a scale that few true crime cases in recent memory had matched, driven in large part by the existence of Sean's extensive social media documentation of their family life, which gave the public an unusually intimate sense of who the victims were and what had been destroyed. People who had followed Sean's videos of Bella and Celeste, 2 little girls who were funny and spirited and unmistakably full of life, felt the loss in a way that was personal and specific rather than abstract, and the outrage directed at Chris Watts was correspondingly intense. In November 2018, facing the possibility of the death penalty if the case went to trial, Watts entered into a plea agreement with prosecutors. He pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on 5 counts, with additional sentences for the remaining charges. He was transported to Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, chosen in part because of concerns about his safety in a Colorado facility given the level of public anger surrounding the case. The story did not end with the sentencing. In February 2019, investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation traveled to Wisconsin to conduct a second interview with Watts, and in that interview, which was subsequently made public, Watts recanted the account he had given in his initial interrogation and admitted the truth of what had happened on the morning of August 13. He admitted that he had strangled Sean in their bed. He admitted that he had gone to his daughter's rooms and smothered Bella and Celeste with their own blankets. He admitted that Sean had not harmed the children. He provided a detailed account of the drive to the oil field, of what he had done with each of his family members' remains, and of his state of mind during and after the murders. The account was clinical and detailed and devoid of the kind of emotional reckoning that the families of the victims had hoped might eventually emerge, and it resolved some of the factual questions that had remained open since the guilty plea while doing nothing whatsoever to make the answers any easier to absorb. Watts told investigators that he had planned the murders the night before, that he had known what he was going to do when Sean came home, and that the affair with Nicole Kessinger had been the primary motivating factor in his decision to destroy his family rather than simply end his marriage through legal means. Kessinger herself was never charged with any crime. Investigators determined that she had no knowledge of Watts's plans and was herself a victim of his deception, and she gave a lengthy interview to investigators in which she described the relationship and her complete shock at what Watts had done. The Watts case became, in the years following the conviction, one of the most extensively analyzed true crime cases of the modern era, the subject of documentaries, books, podcasts, and countless hours of media coverage that attempted to understand how a man who appeared so ordinary, so benign, so thoroughly unremarkable could have done what he did. The psychological literature on family annihilation offered frameworks: the narcissistic injury of perceived failure, the inability to tolerate the constraints of obligation, the compartmentalization that allowed Watts to simultaneously love his daughters and destroy them, but none of the frameworks fully resolved the central mystery of the case, which was not how Chris Watts did what he did but how he managed to be so completely invisible to the people around him for so long. Sean's family, who had welcomed him, trusted him, and loved him as a son and brother, were left to carry a grief compounded by betrayal. The community of Frederick, Colorado, which had watched his television appeal and felt sympathy for him, was left to reckon with the fact that they had been deceived by a man standing in a driveway above the bodies of his wife and children. And the 2 little girls, Bella, who in the weeks before her death had told her grandmother that there was a baby in mommy's tummy, and Celeste, who loved her stuffed animals and her sister with equal and uncomplicated devotion, were left to be remembered in the videos their mother had made, laughing and living and utterly unaware of what was coming, in a life that their father decided one August morning he no longer wanted to share with them. Number 4. Clayton Hartwig, the young Navy sailor whose death inside a battleship's gun turret sparked one of the most controversial and devastating military investigations in American naval history, leaving 47 families without answers and a dead man unable to defend his own name. Clayton Michael Hartwig was born on November 24, 1965, in Cleveland, Ohio, and grew up in a working-class household in the city's western suburbs, a quiet and somewhat solitary young man who struggled throughout his adolescence to find the kind of belonging and purpose that seemed to come naturally to other people around him. He was not a troublemaker, not a delinquent, not someone who attracted attention for the wrong reasons. He was, if anything, almost aggressively unremarkable in the way that certain young people are when they are still searching for an identity that fits, when the world around them has not yet offered anything that feels like a genuine match for whatever is happening inside them. He was interested in military history, in weapons, in the kind of disciplined institutional structure that the armed forces represented, and when he enlisted in the United States Navy in 1982 at the age of 16 with his parents' permission, it seemed to the people who knew him like a reasonable and even logical choice. The Navy would give Clayton Hartwig the structure he craved, the sense of belonging he had not found in civilian life, and the opportunity to be part of something larger than himself in a way that his quiet suburban existence had never provided. He trained as a gunner's mate, specializing in the operation and maintenance of the large naval guns that equipped the Navy's battleships, and he was eventually assigned to the USS Iowa, one of the most storied vessels in the history of the American fleet. A Iowa-class battleship that had served with distinction in World War II and the Korean War and had been recommissioned in 1984 as part of the Reagan administration's effort to rebuild and expand American naval power during the final decade of the Cold War. Life aboard the USS Iowa was in many respects exactly what Clayton Hartwig had hoped military service would be: structured, purposeful, and defined by clear hierarchies and expectations that left little room for the kind of ambiguity that had characterized his civilian years. He was a competent sailor, regarded by his superiors as reliable and technically proficient, and he took his work in the gun turret seriously, developing a genuine expertise in the mechanics and operation of the 16-inch guns that were the Iowa's primary armament, weapons so massive and so powerful that their operation required entire teams of trained specialists working in precise coordination. He also formed close friendships aboard the ship, most notably with a fellow sailor named Kendall Truitt, and the nature of that friendship would become one of the most contested and consequential elements of the investigation that followed the explosion of April 19, 1989. Truitt and Hartwig had been close in a way that their shipmates noted and that, in the context of the military culture of the late 1980s, attracted a degree of comment and speculation. Hartwig had named Truitt as the beneficiary of a life insurance policy worth $100,000, a fact that investigators would later seize upon as potential evidence of motive, and the two men had at various points been the subject of rumors among their crewmates about the nature of their relationship. Rumors that neither man had the opportunity to fully address before the explosion that killed one of them and destroyed the life of the other. The explosion occurred on the morning of April 19, 1989, during a routine gunnery exercise in the Atlantic Ocean approximately 300 miles northeast of Puerto Rico. The USS Iowa was conducting training operations, and the crew of Turret 2, the massive midship gun turret housing 3 of the battleship's 16-inch guns, was preparing to fire a ranging shot as part of the exercise. The process of loading and firing the Iowa's 16-inch guns was extraordinarily complex and physically demanding, involving the precise assembly of powder bags, large silk bags filled with propellant, that were rammed into the gun barrel behind the projectile by a hydraulic rammer before being ignited by the gun's firing mechanism. At approximately 9:47 in the morning, something went catastrophically wrong in the center gun room of Turret 2. An explosion of enormous force erupted inside the turret, killing all 47 men stationed within it almost instantly. The force of the explosion was so great that it blew the heavy steel doors of the turret open and sent a fireball up through the turret's interior, and the ship itself was briefly in danger before the fire was brought under control by the crew. The dead included the entire gun crew of Turret 2, 47 young men, ranging in age from their late teens to their early 30s, many of them on their first or second deployment, all of them gone in a fraction of a second in a way that left no survivors and no direct witnesses to whatever had actually happened in the moments before the explosion. The Navy launched an immediate investigation into the cause of the explosion, and the investigation was conducted under conditions of intense pressure, from the families of the dead, from Congress, from the media, and from the Navy's own institutional need to understand what had happened aboard one of its most prominent vessels. The investigation was led by Rear Admiral Richard Milligan, and it proceeded along two primary tracks: a technical analysis of the physical evidence from the explosion and an examination of the human factors that might have contributed to it. The technical analysis was complicated by the nature of the explosion itself, which had destroyed much of the evidence that might have definitively explained its cause, leaving investigators working from fragments, residue analysis, and the testimony of crew members who had been outside the turret at the time. The examination of human factors quickly focused on the gun crew of Turret 2, and within that crew, on the man who had been closest to the center gun at the moment of the explosion, Clayton Hartwig, whose body had been found in the most severely damaged area of the turret and who had not survived to offer any account of what he had witnessed or done in the final moments before the blast. The Naval Investigative Service, working in parallel with the technical investigation, began examining the backgrounds and personal lives of the Turret 2 crew members, and their examination of Clayton Hartwig produced a profile that investigators found deeply troubling. They discovered the life insurance policy naming Kendall Truitt as beneficiary, and they began interviewing Truitt, who told investigators that his friendship with Hartwig had been complicated and intense, and who provided information that investigators interpreted as suggesting that Hartwig had been emotionally unstable, possibly suicidal, and potentially motivated to cause a catastrophic event. They spoke to other sailors who described Hartwig as someone who had at times seemed depressed or withdrawn, who had made comments about not wanting to live, who had seemed to become increasingly troubled in the months before the explosion. They spoke to people in Hartwig's personal life who described a young man who struggled with loneliness and with questions about his identity and his future. And they commissioned a psychological autopsy, a forensic psychological assessment of a deceased individual based on documentary evidence, interviews with people who knew them, and analysis of their personal writings and communications, that was conducted by specialists from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Science Unit, the same unit that had pioneered the profiling of violent criminals and whose methodologies were at that time regarded as among the most sophisticated in the field. The psychological autopsy concluded that Clayton Hartwig had the characteristics of a person who might engage in an equivocal death, a death that was neither clearly accidental nor clearly suicide, but that was in some sense chosen or facilitated by the individual. The FBI analysts determined that Hartwig fit the profile of someone who would be capable of causing the explosion intentionally, either as a form of suicide or as a violent act against others, and the naval investigation incorporated this conclusion into its final report. In September 1989, the Navy released its findings, and they were as damaging and as consequential as anything the Hartwig family could have imagined. The official conclusion was that the explosion of Turret 2 had been caused deliberately by Clayton Hartwig, who had initiated the blast using an improvised detonating device placed between the powder bags and the projectile in the center gun. The Navy did not charge Hartwig with anything, since he was dead, but the official finding was effectively an accusation of mass murder against a man who could not speak in his own defense, who had no attorney, who had no opportunity to challenge the evidence or cross-examine the witnesses, and whose reputation was destroyed overnight by the announcement of a conclusion that his family immediately and forcefully rejected. The reaction to the Navy's findings was immediate and fierce, and it came from multiple directions simultaneously. The Hartwig family, led by his sister Kathleen Kubicina, launched a sustained and passionate public campaign to challenge the Navy's conclusions and clear her brother's name, and their efforts attracted significant media attention and eventually congressional interest. Several members of Congress, troubled by the procedural irregularities in the investigation and by the question of whether a dead man had been scapegoated to protect the Navy from accountability for a potential accident, called for an independent review of the evidence. The technical conclusions of the Navy's investigation, specifically, the claim that a detonating device had been found and that its residue had been identified in the wreckage, were challenged by independent explosives experts who reviewed the evidence and concluded that the physical evidence was far more consistent with an accidental ignition than with a deliberate explosive device. The psychological autopsy methodology was challenged by mental health professionals who argued that the technique was scientifically unreliable and that the conclusions drawn from it in the Hartwig case were speculative and inadequately supported by the available evidence. And the manner in which Hartwig's personal life, specifically, the speculation about his sexual orientation and the nature of his relationship with Kendall Truitt, had been incorporated into the investigation was criticized as prejudicial and irrelevant, a reflection of the homophobia embedded in military culture rather than a legitimate investigative consideration. The congressional pressure eventually produced a result that was extraordinary by any measure. The Senate Armed Services Committee commissioned an independent technical review of the Iowa explosion by Sandia National Laboratories, one of the United States government's premier research and engineering institutions, and in 1991 Sandia released its findings. The Sandia report was a comprehensive and methodologically rigorous examination of the physical and chemical evidence from the explosion, and its conclusions directly contradicted those of the naval investigation on virtually every significant technical point. Sandia's analysts determined that there was no credible physical evidence of a deliberate detonating device in Turret 2, that the chemical residues identified by the Navy as evidence of an improvised explosive had alternative explanations consistent with accidental ignition, and that the most plausible cause of the explosion was an accidental event, specifically, an overram of the powder bags by the hydraulic rammer, which could have caused the propellant to ignite prematurely under certain conditions. The Sandia report did not definitively establish the cause of the explosion, since the evidence was insufficient for certainty in any direction, but it effectively dismantled the evidentiary foundation of the Navy's conclusion that Hartwig had acted deliberately, and it made the official finding impossible to sustain with any intellectual integrity. The Navy's response to the Sandia findings was, in the estimation of many observers, inadequate to the gravity of what had occurred. In October 1991, the Navy formally retracted the finding that Clayton Hartwig had caused the explosion, acknowledging that the technical evidence did not support the conclusion. The revised official position was that the cause of the explosion was undetermined, not that Hartwig had been innocent, not that the Navy had been wrong to accuse him, but simply that the evidence was insufficient to establish cause with certainty. For the Hartwig family, and for many of the families of the other 46 men killed in the explosion, the retraction was deeply unsatisfying. It acknowledged error without accepting responsibility, it withdrew an accusation without offering an apology, and it left the question of what had actually happened aboard Turret 2 on that April morning permanently and officially unresolved. Kathleen Kubicina continued to advocate for her brother's memory for years after the retraction, arguing that the Navy's willingness to destroy a dead man's reputation rather than acknowledge the possibility of institutional failure or equipment malfunction was a profound moral failure that deserved explicit acknowledgement and genuine accountability. That acknowledgement never came in any form that the family found meaningful. The true cause of the USS Iowa explosion has never been definitively established. The most widely accepted technical hypothesis among independent experts is the overram theory supported by Sandia, but even that conclusion is not universal among specialists who have examined the evidence, and the physical destruction caused by the explosion itself ensures that absolute certainty is almost certainly beyond reach. What can be said with certainty is that 47 young men died on the morning of April 19, 1989, in a catastrophic and still not fully explained event, and that in the aftermath of their deaths, the institutional response of the United States Navy prioritized the assignment of blame over the pursuit of truth, and chose as its target a young man who was already dead and therefore uniquely unable to challenge the accusation being leveled against him. Clayton Hartwig was 23 years old when he died. He had joined the Navy looking for belonging and purpose, had found a degree of both, and had died in service to his country in circumstances that remain genuinely mysterious. Whether he was a victim of a tragic accident, a participant in some form of deliberate act, or simply a young man who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment when something went catastrophically and inexplicably wrong, The process by which his name was attached to 47 deaths and then only partially cleared stands as one of the most troubling examples in modern American history of what can happen when institutions prioritize self-protection over honest reckoning with the truth. Number 5. Diane Downs, the smiling mother who shot her 3 children on a quiet Oregon road, cradled one of them as she died, and then told a story so impossible and so carefully constructed that it almost worked. Elizabeth Diane Downs was born on August 7, 1955, in Chandler, Arizona, and grew up in a household defined by the kind of emotional deprivation that leaves marks so deep and so formative that they shape everything that follows. Marks that clinicians who later examined her would spend considerable time and professional energy attempting to map and understand. Her father, Wes Frederickson, was by multiple accounts a controlling and emotionally abusive man who subjected his daughter to treatment that left her with a profound and consuming need for male attention and validation, a need so intense and so central to her functioning that it would ultimately drive every significant decision she made as an adult, including the most catastrophic one. She was, by the time she reached adulthood, a woman of considerable surface charm. Attractive, talkative, energetic, and possessed of a confidence that drew people to her even as it occasionally made them uneasy in ways they could not quite articulate. She married Robert Downs in 1973, had 3 children with him, Christy, born in 1974, Cheryl, born in 1976, and Danny, born in 1979, and divorced him in 1980. Retaining custody of the children and moving through a series of relationships and relocations that reflected both her restlessness and her relentless pursuit of the romantic connection that she had decided was the organizing principle of her existence. She worked as a mail carrier, a job she performed with competence and reliability, and she presented to the world around her the image of a capable, independent single mother managing the considerable demands of 3 young children with energy and apparent devotion. The reality of her relationship with those children was considerably more complicated than the image suggested, and the complications would become devastatingly apparent on the night of May 19, 1983. The man at the center of everything was named Robert Knickerbocker, a married man with whom Diane Downs had become intensely, obsessively involved during the period leading up to the shooting. Knickerbocker worked at the same postal facility as Downs, and their relationship had developed with a speed and an intensity that reflected Downs's characteristically all-consuming approach to romantic attachment. She was devoted to him in a way that left little room for anything else, including, investigators would later determine, her children, who had come to represent in her mind not so much people she loved as complications she managed, obstacles to the unfettered pursuit of the relationship she wanted. Knickerbocker, for his part, had made clear to Downs that he had no intention of leaving his wife and that his feelings for Downs, while genuine in their way, did not extend to the kind of permanent commitment she was seeking. He had also made clear, in conversations that Downs later recounted to investigators with a frankness that stunned them, that children were a problem, that he did not want to be involved with a woman who had 3 young children, that the children complicated any future they might have together, and that if she wanted a life with him she would need to resolve that complication somehow. Whether Knickerbocker intended these comments as anything more than expressions of his reluctance about the relationship or whether he understood how literally and how fatally Diane Downs would eventually interpret them is a question that was never definitively resolved, but the comments existed, Downs had heard them, and she had processed them through a psychological framework that produced consequences no ordinary person could have anticipated. On the evening of May 19, 1983, Diane Downs loaded her 3 children, 8-year-old Christy, 7-year-old Cheryl, and 3-year-old Danny, into her car in Springfield, Oregon, where the family was living at the time, and drove out onto Old Mohawk Road, a quiet rural highway on the outskirts of the city. What happened on that road in the darkness is known from the physical evidence, from the testimony of Christy Downs, who survived, and from the various accounts that Diane Downs herself gave in the hours, days, and months that followed, accounts that changed and shifted and contradicted each other in ways that investigators found increasingly impossible to reconcile with innocence. At some point on Old Mohawk Road, Downs stopped the car and shot all 3 of her children with a .22 caliber pistol. She shot Christy in the chest. She shot Cheryl in the chest. She shot Danny in the chest. Cheryl, the 7-year-old, died from her wound. Christy survived but suffered a stroke caused by blood loss that left her partially paralyzed on one side of her body. Danny survived but the bullet that struck him severed his spinal cord, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down, a condition that would be permanent. After shooting her children, Diane Downs drove to Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, arriving at approximately 10:48 in the evening, with her children bleeding in the car. She walked into the emergency room and told the staff that a bushy-haired stranger had flagged down her car on Old Mohawk Road, attempted to carjack it, and when she had refused to hand over the keys had shot her children through the open car window before fleeing into the darkness. She was calm. She was coherent. And she was, in the assessment of the emergency room staff who encountered her that night, behaving in a way that did not match what she was describing. There was an effect to her, a composure, a distance from the horror of what she was saying had just happened to her children that the nurses and doctors who worked on the children found profoundly disturbing. The investigation that followed was conducted by the Lane County Sheriff's Office, and from the very beginning it was shaped by the tension between the story Downs was telling and the evidence that investigators were finding, a tension that grew more acute with each passing day as the two sides pulled further and further apart. The physical evidence at the scene on Old Mohawk Road was sparse in ways that troubled investigators. There were no shell casings consistent with a struggle or a carjacking, no tire tracks suggesting that another vehicle had stopped on the road, no physical evidence of any kind that corroborated the presence of a bushy-haired stranger or anyone else. The wound patterns on the children were consistent with shots fired at close range from inside or immediately adjacent to the car rather than from outside through a window, as Downs had described. And Downs herself, in the days following the shooting, behaved in ways that investigators and hospital staff found increasingly difficult to attribute to grief. She visited the hospital cheerfully, brought flowers, joked with staff, and on one occasion, when a nurse broke down crying while discussing Cheryl's death, Downs reportedly comforted the nurse rather than displaying any visible distress of her own. She gave media interviews. She appeared on television. She spoke about the bushy-haired stranger with a consistency and a detail that suggested rehearsal rather than traumatic recall, and she submitted to multiple investigative interviews with a willingness that investigators initially interpreted as cooperation but gradually came to understand as confidence. The confidence of someone who believed that her story was good enough to hold. The investigation was significantly complicated by the fact that the primary surviving witness, Christy Downs, was in critical condition for weeks following the shooting and was unable to communicate meaningfully with investigators during the most critical early phase of the case. When Christy eventually recovered sufficiently to speak, the accounts she gave were carefully and sensitively gathered by investigators who were acutely aware of both the evidentiary value of what she might say and the profound psychological fragility of an 8-year-old child who had been shot by her own mother and watched her sister die. Christie's early communications were limited and ambiguous, and the defense would later argue that investigators had improperly influenced her recollections through the manner in which they questioned her, an argument that the prosecution vigorously disputed. What Christie eventually communicated, and what she testified to at trial, was that the bushy-haired stranger had not existed, that her mother had been the one with the gun, and that what had happened on Old Mohawk Road had not been a carjacking but something far more deliberate and far more intimate and far more terrible than that. The testimony of an 8-year-old child who had survived being shot by her mother, delivered in a courtroom in front of her mother, against her mother, is among the most harrowing things that the Oregon legal system has ever asked anyone to do, and the courage it represented was not lost on the jury that heard it. The prosecution of Diane Downs was led by Assistant District Attorney Fred Hughey, who had become personally and deeply involved in the welfare of Christy and Danny Downs during the investigation and who would eventually, after the trial, adopt both children along with his wife. Hughey built the prosecution's case around 3 primary pillars: the physical evidence that contradicted Downs's account of the shooting, the testimony of medical and behavioral experts who addressed the wound patterns and the defendant's effect and demeanor in the aftermath of the crime, and the testimony of Christy Downs herself. The prosecution also presented evidence of Downs's relationship with Knickerbocker and of the conversations in which he had expressed his reluctance about involvement with a woman who had children, evidence that went directly to the question of motive and that painted a picture of a woman who had decided that her children's lives were worth less than the romantic future she was trying to construct. The defense, for its part, worked hard to challenge the physical evidence, to undermine Christie's credibility as a witness, and to present an alternative narrative in which Downs was a victim of the criminal who had shot her children, and of an investigation that had decided she was guilty before examining the evidence with appropriate objectivity. They also presented Downs herself, who testified in her own defense with a fluency and a composure that many observers found more damaging than helpful, since the quality of her performance on the witness stand reinforced rather than dispelled the impression that she was a woman who was very good at managing appearances and very poor at genuine emotional authenticity. The trial lasted several weeks and produced one of the most scrutinized bodies of testimony in Oregon legal history. The jury deliberated for approximately 5 hours before returning verdicts of guilty on all charges: 1 count of murder for the death of Cheryl, 2 counts of attempted murder for the shootings of Christy and Danny, and 1 count of first-degree assault. Judge Gregory Foote sentenced Diane Downs to life imprisonment plus 50 years, the most severe sentence available under Oregon law at the time, and he did so with remarks that made clear the depth of his assessment of what she had done. He described her crime as one of the most heinous he had encountered in his judicial career and made plain that in his view the sentence was not merely a punishment but a statement about the absolute inviolability of the obligation a parent owes to their children. Downs was taken into custody and began serving her sentence at the Oregon Women's Correctional Center in Salem, where she would remain for the next several years, conducting herself with the same unsettling composure that had characterized her throughout the investigation and trial, giving interviews to journalists and authors, and maintaining, with a consistency that never wavered, that she was innocent and that the real perpetrator had never been found. The case attracted enormous national attention in large part because of the work of true crime author and Rule, whose book Small Sacrifices, published in 1987, provided a comprehensive and deeply reported account of the crime, the investigation, the trial, and the psychology of Diane Downs that introduced the case to millions of readers who had not followed the original proceedings. Rule, who had known Downs personally before the crime through a shared acquaintance and who brought to the book both journalistic rigor and genuine personal horror at what she had learned, produced what many critics and criminologists consider one of the finest works of true crime literature ever written, a book that did more than any other single document to shape the public understanding of Diane Downs and of the specific psychological profile she represented. The book was subsequently adapted into a television film starring Farrah Fawcett in a performance that was widely praised and that brought the story to an audience even larger than the book had reached. Through all of this attention, through all of the coverage and the analysis and the public fascination, Diane Downs sat in her prison cell and wrote letters and gave interviews and maintained her innocence. A woman who had shot 3 children on a dark Oregon road and watched one of them die, and who had never, in any forum or in any context, offered anything that the people who knew the case recognized as a genuine reckoning with what she had done. In July 1987, Downs escaped from the Oregon Women's Correctional Center by scaling a fence, and she remained at large for 10 days before being recaptured in Tijeras, New Mexico, where she had been staying with a man she had met through correspondence while in prison. The escape added an additional 49 months to her sentence and confirmed, for those who needed confirmation, that the institutional containment of Diane Downs was not merely a matter of punishment but of genuine public safety. She has appeared before the Oregon Board of Parole and Post-Prison Supervision for parole hearings at regular intervals, and she has been denied parole at every appearance, the board consistently finding that she continues to represent a danger to the community and that she has not demonstrated the kind of genuine accountability and behavioral change that parole consideration requires. Christy Downs, who survived the shooting and whose testimony helped convict her mother, grew up in the care of Fred and Joanne Hughey, changed her name, and has lived her adult life in a privacy that she has maintained with great determination, declining the many requests for interviews and public comment that have come her way over the decades. Danny Downs, who was left paralyzed by the bullet that struck his spine, similarly grew up with the Hugheys and has similarly maintained his privacy. The two children who survived the night on Old Mohawk Road built lives for themselves in the shadow of something that should never have happened to them, and the lives they built are their own achievement, a testament to resilience in the face of a betrayal so fundamental and so intimate that it is almost impossible for anyone who was not there to fully comprehend what it cost them and what it continues to cost them every single day. Number 6. Scott Peterson, the fertilizer salesman who murdered his pregnant wife on Christmas Eve, spent the holidays calling her cell phone to leave concerned messages, and was already planning a future with his mistress before Laci's body was ever found. Scott Lee Peterson was born on October 24, 1972, in San Diego, California, and grew up in a household that was by most external measures comfortable, stable, and unremarkable in the ways that matter most to the formation of character. He was the youngest of 5 children, adopted by Lee and Jackie Peterson shortly after birth, and raised in a family environment that his parents and siblings later described as warm and supportive, a characterization that made the events of December 2002 all the more incomprehensible to the people who thought they knew him. Scott was athletic, personable, and possessed of an easy, practiced charm that made him immediately likable to virtually everyone he encountered. He was the kind of young man who moved through social situations with a fluency that suggested either genuine confidence or a very sophisticated simulation of it, and for most of his life the people around him never felt the need to examine too closely which of those two things it actually was. He attended California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, where he studied agricultural business, and it was there that he met Laci Rocha, a vivacious and warm young woman from Modesto, California, who was studying ornamental horticulture and who fell for Scott with a completeness and a sincerity that everyone who knew her recognized as entirely characteristic of who she was. Laci Rocha was not a complicated person in the way that the word complicated sometimes implies a certain darkness or opacity. She was genuinely and straightforwardly good, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and brought food to sick neighbors and whose enthusiasm for the people she loved was so uncomplicated and so consistent that it made everyone around her feel valued in a way that was not easy to manufacture or to fake. She loved Scott Peterson, and she believed that he loved her, and when they married in August 1997 and settled into a house on Covina Avenue in Modesto, California, and began building a life together that included a golden retriever named Mackenzie and Laci's work as a substitute teacher and Scott's job as a fertilizer salesman for Trade Corp USA. There was nothing visible to anyone who knew them that suggested the life they were building was anything other than what it appeared to be. The reality beneath the surface of the Peterson marriage was considerably more complicated, though the complications were almost entirely of Scott's making and almost entirely concealed from Laci. Scott Peterson was not a faithful husband. He had been involved in multiple extramarital relationships during the course of the marriage, a pattern of behavior that Laci was apparently unaware of and that Scott managed with the same facility he brought to every other aspect of his public presentation. The relationship that would ultimately become the central fact of the investigation into Laci's disappearance began in November 2002, approximately 6 weeks before the murder, when Scott met a woman named Amber Fry at a party in Fresno, California. Amber Fry was a massage therapist, a single mother, and a woman of genuine decency who had no knowledge that the man she was becoming involved with was married, let alone that his wife was 8 months pregnant. Scott told Amber that he was not married, that he had lost his wife and was spending his first holiday season alone, a lie of such specific and calculated cruelty, constructed at precisely the moment when Laci was visibly, joyfully pregnant and they had recently announced they were naming their son Connor, that even investigators hardened by years of exposure to human dishonesty found it remarkable. The relationship between Scott and Amber developed quickly in the weeks that followed, conducted through phone calls and text messages and in-person meetings that Scott arranged around his work schedule and his domestic obligations. And by the time Christmas arrived, Scott Peterson was managing a double life with a smoothness that suggested either considerable practice or a near-total absence of the kind of emotional friction that makes deception difficult for most people. Laci Peterson was last seen alive on the morning of December 23, 2002, when a neighbor spotted her walking Mackenzie in the neighborhood near their home. Scott Peterson would later tell investigators that he had last seen Laci at the house that morning before he left for a fishing trip to the Berkeley Marina, approximately 90 miles from Modesto, where he had launched his 14-foot aluminum boat into San Francisco Bay and spent several hours fishing for sturgeon, or so he said. He returned home in the late afternoon, put the boat back in the garage, showered, and went to his in-laws' house for a Christmas Eve gathering, where he reported that Laci had not come home and that she was not answering her phone. The family contacted the Modesto Police Department, and the search for Laci Peterson began. It would continue for more than 4 months, through the Christmas holiday and into the new year, sustained by the efforts of Laci's family, particularly her mother Sharon Rocha and her brother Brent Rocha, and by a community in Modesto that rallied around the search with a generosity and a sustained commitment that became one of the defining features of the case in its early months. Volunteers searched fields and waterways. Tip lines were established. Reward funds were raised. And Scott Peterson participated in all of it, appearing at press conferences, giving interviews, holding Laci's photograph for the cameras, and conducting himself throughout in a manner that investigators noted was consistently slightly off in ways that were difficult to specify but impossible to ignore. A calmness that exceeded what grief typically produces, a precision in his speech that suggested management rather than devastation, and an apparent comfort with public attention that struck Laci's family as increasingly incongruous with the role of a husband whose pregnant wife had vanished. The investigation took its decisive turn almost immediately, not because investigators had found physical evidence linking Scott to Laci's disappearance, but because Scott Peterson made a choice in the first days of the investigation that was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential errors of judgment in the history of high-profile criminal cases. He called Amber Frey. He called her repeatedly, and the calls were recorded, because Amber Frey, who had seen the news coverage of Laci's disappearance, recognized Scott Peterson's name and face, and contacted the Modesto Police Department on December 30, 2002, had agreed to cooperate with investigators and had been fitted with recording equipment that captured every conversation she had with Scott from that point forward. The recordings that resulted from Amber Frey's cooperation with law enforcement constitute one of the most extraordinary bodies of evidence ever assembled in an American murder investigation. They are hours of Scott Peterson conducting his affair, managing Amber's growing anxiety about the case, constructing elaborate lies about his whereabouts and his situation, expressing tender concern for a woman while his pregnant wife's body lay somewhere in San Francisco Bay, and revealing in the unguarded moments of intimate conversation a coldness and a self-absorption that the recordings captured with a clarity that no amount of courtroom testimony could have matched. At one point, Scott called Amber from a candlelight vigil being held in Modesto for Laci's safe return, and the image of him standing at that vigil, surrounded by people who loved his wife and were praying for her safety, while conducting a phone call with the woman he had been seeing since before the murder, became one of the defining moments in the public perception of who Scott Peterson was. Investigators built their case methodically over the months that followed, gathering evidence from the Peterson home, from Scott's financial records, from the accounts of people who had interacted with him in the days and weeks surrounding the disappearance, and from the continuing recordings of his conversations with Amber Frey. A key piece of evidence was the discovery that Scott had purchased a boat in mid-December 2002, approximately 2 weeks before Laci disappeared, a purchase he had not disclosed to Laci or to her family and that he initially attempted to conceal from investigators, claiming the boat had been in his possession for a longer period. The boat was small, 14 feet long, and investigators noted that it was the kind of vessel that would have been barely adequate for the fishing trip Scott claimed to have made to San Francisco Bay on the day of Laci's disappearance, a trip that experienced fishermen who examined the conditions at the Berkeley Marina that day described as an unusual choice under the circumstances, particularly for someone fishing alone in an unfamiliar area with inadequate equipment and no apparent record of prior use of that specific location. The boat itself yielded forensic evidence during examination, including a hair consistent with Laci's and traces of concrete, that further tightened the evidentiary picture investigators were constructing. The case broke open on April 13 and 14, 2003, when the bodies of a fetus and a woman were discovered on the shoreline of San Francisco Bay near Point Isabel, just north of the Berkeley Marina, the same area where Scott Peterson had told investigators he had been fishing on the day Laci disappeared. The fetus, which was recovered first, had partially emerged from a section of what remained of its mother, and DNA testing confirmed that the two sets of remains were those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son Connor. The condition of the remains, affected by months of immersion in seawater and the attentions of marine life, made precise determination of cause of death impossible, but investigators had enough. Scott Peterson was placed under physical surveillance in the days following the discovery of the remains, and on April 18, 2003, he was arrested in La Jolla, California, near the Mexican border, carrying nearly $15,000 in cash, his brother's identification, multiple cell phones, camping equipment, and survival gear. Details that prosecutors would later argue demonstrated consciousness of guilt and an intention to flee. His hair had been dyed from its natural dark color to a lighter shade, and he was wearing a beard, alterations that his defense team would characterize as insignificant personal grooming choices and that the prosecution would characterize as evidence of a man preparing to disappear. The trial of Scott Peterson was one of the most extensively covered legal proceedings in American history, a reflection both of the facts of the case and of the particular cultural moment in which it occurred, the early years of cable news saturation and the beginning of the Internet's transformation of how Americans consumed true crime content. It was moved from Modesto to Redwood City in San Mateo County due to the intense pretrial publicity in the Stanislaus County area, and it drew journalists and commentators from across the country who provided daily, sometimes hourly updates on the proceedings. The prosecution was led by Deputy District Attorney Rick DeStaso and Assistant District Attorney Dave Harris, and the defense was led by Mark Garagos, a prominent and experienced criminal defense attorney who had taken the case with considerable public confidence in his ability to achieve an acquittal. Garagos's defense strategy centered on the argument that the physical evidence against Scott was entirely circumstantial, that no cause of death had been established, that no murder weapon had been found, that no witness had seen Scott commit the crime, and that the investigation had been compromised by investigators' early fixation on Scott as the primary suspect to the exclusion of other possibilities. He pointed to a burglary that had occurred near the Covina Avenue house on the morning of Laci's disappearance and argued that the real perpetrators of that burglary might have been responsible for Laci's abduction and death. The prosecution countered with the totality of the circumstantial evidence: the affair, the boat purchase, the fishing trip to the precise location where the bodies were eventually found, the recorded phone calls with Amber Fry, the financial evidence suggesting Scott had been researching the tidal patterns of San Francisco Bay, the concrete anchor weights found at the family home, the hair found on the boat, and the pattern of behavior in the weeks following Laci's disappearance that was in the prosecution's framing, the behavior of a guilty man performing innocence rather than an innocent man consumed by grief. The jury, which deliberated for approximately 7 days, returned verdicts of guilty on November 12, 2004, first-degree murder for the death of Laci and second-degree murder for the death of Connor, the latter charge reflecting the legal status of an unborn child under California law. The sentencing phase produced a recommendation of death, and Scott Peterson was sentenced to death by Judge Alfred DeLucci, who added his own remarks indicating that he found the evidence of guilt overwhelming. Peterson was transported to San Quentin State Prison to await execution. The case did not end with the sentencing. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence, not on the basis of his guilt or innocence but because of errors in the jury selection process, specifically, the improper exclusion of several jurors who had expressed reservations about the death penalty, an exclusion that the court found had violated Peterson's constitutional right to an impartial jury. The court affirmed the murder convictions themselves, finding that the evidence of guilt had been sufficient to support the verdicts, but ordered a new penalty phase to determine whether Peterson should be sentenced to death or to life without parole. In 2021, a Stanislaus County judge sentenced Peterson to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that removed him from death row and resolved the penalty question without addressing the underlying conviction. Peterson has maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration and has pursued multiple avenues of post-conviction relief, most notably through claims advanced by his legal team that new evidence exists pointing to alternative perpetrators, claims that the courts have thus far found insufficient to warrant a new trial. Laci Peterson's family, her mother Sharon, her brother Brent, and the stepfather Ron Gransky, who had been a steady presence in the family since Laci's childhood, have been consistent and unwavering in their position that Scott Peterson murdered their daughter and granddaughter, and that every year he continues to pursue claims of innocence is another year of pain imposed on people who have already suffered more than anyone should have to bear. Laci Peterson was 27 years old when she died. She had chosen a name for her son. She had decorated a nursery. She had spent the weeks before Christmas buying gifts for the people she loved, and she had believed, with the kind of complete and unguarded trust that defines genuine love, that the man she had married was the person he had always presented himself to be. Number 7. Neil Entwistle, the British software engineer who murdered his American wife and 9-month-old daughter in their Massachusetts home, tucked their bodies into bed as though they were simply sleeping, and boarded a flight to England before anyone realized they were dead. Neil Entwistle was born on March 25, 1978, in Worksop, Nottinghamshire, a small industrial town in the north of England, and grew up in a working-class household that provided him with a stable if unremarkable foundation from which he eventually distinguished himself academically, earning a degree in electronic engineering from the University of York and subsequently a master's degree in the same field, credentials that positioned him as a young man of genuine intellectual capability and professional promise. He was quiet, somewhat reserved, not particularly memorable to the people who encountered him in passing, but capable of making a strong impression in more sustained interactions, particularly with people who valued intelligence and technical competence as indicators of character. He met Rachel Souza, an American woman from Carver, Massachusetts, while she was studying in England, and the relationship that developed between them was, by all accounts from the people who knew Rachel, genuinely loving on her side. She was a warm, grounded, deeply family-oriented young woman who had grown up in a close-knit community south of Boston and who saw in Neil Entwistle a future that she was genuinely excited to build. They married in August 2003 in a ceremony that Rachel's family attended with the kind of wholehearted enthusiasm that reflected how much they loved her and how much they wanted her to be happy, and in the years that followed the wedding the couple lived in England before Rachel's desire to be closer to her family brought them back to the United States, settling eventually in the small town of Hopkinton, Massachusetts, in a rented house on Cubs Path Road that they moved into in late 2005 with their infant daughter Lillian Rose, who had been born on April 6, 2005, and who was by every account a healthy, beautiful, and entirely adored child who represented everything Rachel had wanted and everything she was building her life around. The picture that the Entwistle household presented to the outside world in the months leading up to the murders was one of a young family in the early stages of establishing itself. A new home, a new baby, parents figuring out the rhythms of their new life with the kind of exhausted but genuine happiness that new parenthood typically produces in people who wanted the child they have. Rachel was devoted to Lillian in a way that her family and friends described as total and joyful, the kind of mother who was fully present with her daughter in a manner that people around her found beautiful to witness. Neil presented himself as similarly devoted, as a loving husband and father who was working to establish himself professionally in his new country, pursuing various business ventures and technology projects that he described to Rachel and to her family in terms that suggested both ambition and progress. What Neil did not tell Rachel, and what Rachel almost certainly did not know, was that the business ventures he described were largely fictional, that the professional progress he spoke of was almost entirely fabricated, and that beneath the surface of the life he was presenting to his wife and to her family lay a reality of financial desperation, systematic deception, and a pattern of behavior that investigators would later characterize as one of the most elaborate and sustained deceptions they had encountered in a domestic homicide case. Neil Entwistle had been running a series of internet-based scams in the period leading up to the murders, schemes that promised services or products to customers who paid upfront and received nothing in return, generating complaints and chargebacks, and the kind of accumulating online trail that creates both financial and legal exposure for the people who operate such schemes. He had represented himself to Rachel and to her family as a successful entrepreneur when the reality was that he was generating minimal legitimate income and had been supplementing whatever he earned through the scams with money borrowed from Rachel's family and with credit that was rapidly becoming unmanageable. He had also, investigators discovered, been accessing websites related to pornography and to escort services, and had conducted internet searches in the days before the murders that included searches for methods of killing people and for ways to obtain firearms. Searches that were recovered from the family's computer during the investigation and that provided some of the most chilling documentary evidence of premeditation that the prosecution would eventually present at trial. The financial situation had been deteriorating for months, and by January 2006 it had reached a point where Entwistle appears to have concluded that there was no path forward that did not involve a reckoning with the gap between the life he had constructed in Rachel's imagination and the reality of what he had actually built. A reckoning that he was either unwilling or unable to face. On the night of January 20, 2006, or in the early morning hours of January 21, Neil Entwistle took a .38 caliber revolver that belonged to Rachel's father, Joseph Matarazzo, a weapon kept at the Matarazzo family home that Entwistle had access to and had apparently removed without permission, and he used it to shoot his wife and daughter as they lay together in the master bedroom of the Cubs Path Road house. Rachel was shot once in the head. Lillian, who was lying beside her mother, was shot once in the abdomen. The manner in which the bodies were subsequently arranged, tucked under the covers of the bed, positioned as though sleeping, with a blanket drawn up over both of them in a way that concealed the wounds, was one of the details that investigators found most disturbing when they eventually entered the house. Not because it demonstrated any particular forensic sophistication, but because of what it suggested about the psychological state of the man who had done it. There was something in the act of covering them, of arranging them in the posture of peaceful sleep, that spoke to a quality in Entwistle's psychology that prosecutors would later attempt to articulate at trial: a dissociation, a compartmentalization, an ability to perform gestures of care and tenderness toward the people he had just murdered that was as incomprehensible as everything else about what he had done. After shooting his wife and daughter, Neil Entwistle drove to the Matarazzo family home in Carver, returned the revolver to the location from which he had taken it, and then drove to Logan International Airport in Boston. On January 20, 2006, before anyone had discovered the bodies in Hopkinton, Neil Entwistle boarded a flight to London. He landed in England and made his way to his parents' home in Worksop, where he settled in and waited, in the manner of a man who had decided that distance was the only solution he had available to him, for whatever came next. What came next arrived faster than he may have anticipated. Rachel's mother, Priscilla Matarazzo, had arranged to meet Rachel and Lillian on January 22, and when Rachel failed to appear and failed to respond to calls and messages, Priscilla contacted a mutual friend who went to the Cubs Path Road house and, finding the door unlocked and the house apparently empty, entered and eventually found Rachel and Lillian in the bedroom. The friend initially believed they were sleeping and attempted to wake them before the reality of what she was seeing became impossible to deny. She called emergency services, and within hours the Hopkinton house was a crime scene and the Middlesex County District Attorney's Office had opened a murder investigation. The investigation moved with considerable speed given the relative simplicity of the immediate circumstances. There was no sign of forced entry at the house, no evidence of a struggle, no indication that anyone other than the residents of the home had been present, and Neil Entwistle was nowhere to be found. Investigators examining the couple's computer found the internet search history that documented Entwistle's searches for killing methods, found evidence of the financial schemes he had been operating, and found other material that painted a picture of a man whose private life was radically inconsistent with the public persona he had maintained. They also found evidence that established with reasonable certainty the timeline of his departure from the country, credit card records, airport surveillance footage, and airline records that placed him on a flight to London within hours of the murders. Interpol was contacted, British authorities were alerted, and investigators from Massachusetts traveled to England to coordinate the response with their counterparts at the Metropolitan Police Service and with the Crown Prosecution Service. Neil Entwistle was arrested in Worksop, England, on February 9, 2006, approximately 3 weeks after the murders and his flight from the United States. The arrest was conducted by British police working in cooperation with American investigators, and Entwistle was taken into custody without incident, presenting to the officers who arrested him the same composure and compliance that he had apparently maintained throughout the weeks since the murders. The extradition process that followed was complicated by the legal frameworks governing the transfer of suspects between the United States and the United Kingdom, but it proceeded without the kind of protracted legal battle that extradition cases sometimes produce, and Entwistle was returned to Massachusetts in June 2006 to face prosecution. He was held without bail and remained in custody through the lengthy pretrial period during which his legal team prepared his defense and the prosecution assembled its case. The trial of Neil Entwistle began in June 2008 in Middlesex County Superior Court, before Judge Diane Downs, and it lasted approximately 3 weeks. The prosecution's case was built around 4 primary categories of evidence: the forensic evidence from the crime scene, the computer search history, the financial records documenting the schemes and the desperation, and the circumstantial evidence of flight that the prosecution argued demonstrated consciousness of guilt in its most direct form. The forensic evidence was particularly significant, as investigators had been able to establish through ballistic analysis that the weapon used to kill Rachel and Lillian was the revolver belonging to Joseph Matarazzo, and through DNA analysis that trace evidence placing Entwistle at the scene of the murders was consistent with him having been in close physical proximity to the victims at the time they were shot. The computer search history, the searches for killing methods, for firearms, for the kind of information that a person contemplating murder rather than a person living a normal domestic life would seek out, was presented to the jury with a directness that the prosecution knew carried significant persuasive weight, since it went directly to the question of premeditation and intent. The defense strategy constructed by Entwistle's attorneys centered on a theory that was, in its outlines, audacious. They argued that Rachel Entwistle had herself shot Lillian and then turned the gun on herself in an act of murder-suicide, and that Neil Entwistle had discovered the bodies, panicked in a state of psychological collapse, and fled to England not as a guilty man escaping justice but as a devastated and overwhelmed husband and father who had not known what to do in the face of an unimaginable tragedy. The defense pointed to the manner in which the bodies had been found, tucked under the covers, as evidence consistent with a grieving husband covering his family rather than a murderer arranging a scene, and they challenged aspects of the forensic evidence and the investigative conclusions that they argued had been shaped by investigators' early assumption of Entwistle's guilt. The theory required the jury to accept a set of circumstances: a mother shooting her infant daughter, then positioning herself to be shot, with no history of depression or mental illness and no note or other communication explaining her actions, that the prosecution argued was not merely improbable but effectively impossible given everything known about Rachel Entwistle's state of mind, her relationship with her daughter, and the physical evidence at the scene. The jury deliberated for approximately 14 hours over 3 days before returning verdicts of guilty on both counts of first-degree murder on June 26, 2008. Judge Downs sentenced Neil Entwistle to 2 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence under Massachusetts law for first-degree murder convictions. Entwistle showed little visible reaction to the verdicts or the sentence, maintaining in the courtroom the same composure that had characterized his public presentation throughout the proceedings, a composure that Rachel's family, sitting in the gallery and watching the man who had killed their daughter and granddaughter receive his sentence, found as infuriating as everything else about him. Joseph and Priscilla Matarazzo, who had welcomed Neil Entwistle into their family and trusted him with their daughter, who had lent him money they did not know would never be repaid and whose revolver had been used to kill the 2 people they loved most in the world, made statements to the court and to the media that communicated both the depth of their grief and the steadiness of their determination that Lillian and Rachel would be remembered for who they were rather than for how they died. Neil Entwistle has remained at a Massachusetts correctional facility since his sentencing, and he has pursued post-conviction appeals through the Massachusetts court system, all of which have been unsuccessful. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court reviewed his case and affirmed both the convictions and the sentence, finding no reversible error in the trial proceedings and determining that the evidence presented to the jury had been sufficient to support the verdicts beyond a reasonable doubt. Rachel Entwistle was 27 years old when she died. Lillian Rose Entwistle was 9 months old. They had been in their new home for less than 2 months, in a house that Rachel had been excited about and that Lillian had barely had time to know, and they had been killed by the man who was supposed to be the safest person in both of their lives, tucked under their covers in a gesture that was either the most chilling act of dissociation in the case or its most revealing one, left there for someone else to find while the man responsible flew across an ocean and sat in his parents' living room and waited to see whether distance could substitute for the kind of accountability that the law and the families of Rachel and Lillian were determined to ensure he could not escape. Number 8. Robert Durst, the eccentric billionaire heir who was suspected of 3 murders across 3 decades, talked his way out of 2 of them, and was finally convicted at the age of 78 after accidentally confessing on camera while believing the microphone was turned off. Robert Allen Durst was born on April 12, 1943, in New York City, into one of the most powerful real estate dynasties in American history. His father Seymour Durst was the patriarch of the Durst Organization, a Manhattan real estate empire that owned and managed some of the most valuable commercial property in New York, a business that had been built over generations and that represented a level of wealth and social influence that placed the Durst family firmly among the American elite. Robert grew up in Scarsdale, New York, in a household defined by privilege, expectation, and a particular kind of emotional coldness that the people who knew the family well described as pervasive and largely unacknowledged. The defining trauma of Robert Durst's childhood, by his own account and by the account of virtually everyone who has examined his psychology with any seriousness, occurred on January 8, 1950, when Robert, 7 years old, was awakened in the night and witnessed his mother Bernice standing on the roof of the family home before she fell to her death in circumstances that were officially ruled a suicide. Robert Durst carried that image with him for the rest of his life, and the psychological literature generated by his various legal proceedings returned to it repeatedly as a point of origin for the profound instability, dissociation, and disordered attachment that characterized his adult relationships and his behavior in moments of crisis. He was not, by any clinical measure, a well man, and he had not been one since that January night in Scarsdale, but the wealth and the family name and the legal resources that came with both ensured that for most of his life the consequences of his instability were managed, contained, and ultimately absorbed by a system of privilege that ordinary people accused of far lesser things could never have accessed. Robert attended Lehigh University and then the University of California, Los Angeles, where he studied economics, and he eventually returned to New York to work in the family real estate business, though his relationship with his father and with his brother Douglas, who would eventually take control of the Durst Organization, was consistently strained and became increasingly bitter over the years as Robert felt himself marginalized within the family enterprise and denied the leadership role he believed was rightfully his. He married Kathleen McCormick in 1973, a young woman from a middle-class Long Island family who was studying to become a physician's assistant and who was, by the accounts of the friends who knew them as a couple, initially happy in the relationship before the happiness began to erode under the pressure of Robert's increasingly erratic behavior, his emotional volatility, his jealousy, and what Kathy, as she was known, described to her friends and family in the years leading up to her disappearance as a marriage that had become frightening in ways she was not always willing to specify. The Dursts lived between a Manhattan apartment and a weekend house in South Salem, New York, and the contrast between their public social life, dinner parties, professional connections, the ordinary rhythms of upper-class New York existence, and what Kathy experienced privately in her marriage was, according to the people she confided in, becoming increasingly extreme as the early 1980s progressed. Kathy Durst was last seen alive on the night of January 31, 1982, when she and Robert had been at their South Salem house following what multiple witnesses described as a difficult weekend marked by arguments and tension. Robert Durst would tell investigators, when he reported her missing 5 days later on February 4, a delay he explained by saying he had assumed she had simply gone to stay with friends, that he had put Kathy in a car to New York City late on the night of January 31st and that she had called him from her Manhattan apartment later that evening to confirm she had arrived safely. The call he described was never corroborated. No one saw Kathy Durst after that night. Her car was found at the South Salem house. Her medical school, where she was a student, reported that she had failed to appear for classes. And despite an initial investigation by New York State Police that included interviews with Robert Durst and an examination of the South Salem property, No charges were filed and no body was ever found, and the disappearance of Kathy Durst was eventually classified as a missing persons case and allowed to recede from active investigation, while Robert Durst, protected by his family's legal resources and social position, continued his life. He would not be seriously investigated for Kathy's disappearance for nearly 2 decades, and by the time investigators revisited the case with genuine determination, whatever physical evidence might once have existed had long since been lost to time. The second death connected to Robert Durst was that of Susan Berman, a writer and longtime friend who had grown up in Las Vegas as the daughter of a prominent organized crime figure and who had known Durst since their days as students at UCLA in the 1960s. Berman and Durst had maintained a close friendship over the intervening decades, and Berman had provided Robert with an alibi during the initial investigation into Kathy's disappearance, telling investigators that she had spoken with Kathy by phone after the night of January 31st, a claim that investigators who later re-examined the case came to believe was false and that Berman had made at Durst's request to protect him. By the year 2000, Berman was in serious financial difficulty, living in her Benedict Canyon home in Los Angeles and struggling with debts that she had been unable to manage, and she had been in contact with Durst in the period leading up to her death, a contact that investigators would later characterize as significant given the timing of what followed. In December 2000, New York investigators who had reopened the Kathy Durst disappearance case were preparing to contact Berman for a new interview, an interview that Durst apparently knew was coming. On December 23, 2000, Susan Berman was found dead in her home, shot once in the back of the head in what investigators determined was an execution-style killing. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, and no witnesses. A handwritten note had been sent to the Beverly Hills Police Department directing them to her address and identifying the location as the site of a cadaver, a note that was later subjected to extensive forensic analysis and that investigators concluded had been written by Robert Durst, though the conclusion was disputed by the defense. Robert Durst was not immediately charged with Berman's murder, and the case went unsolved for years while investigators gathered evidence and pursued leads that were complicated by the passage of time and the physical distance between Durst's movements and the crime scene. In the months following Berman's death, Durst made a decision that has never been fully explained. He moved to Galveston, Texas, rented a room in a boarding house, and began living under a female alias, disguising himself as a mute woman named Dorothy Senior and navigating the social landscape of a Galveston rooming house with an eccentricity that was remarkable even by the standards of a man who had always been remarkable for his eccentricity. His neighbor in the boarding house was a 71-year-old man named Morris Black, and the relationship between Durst and Black deteriorated over the months they lived in proximity to each other in ways that neither man apparently managed well. In September 2001, Morris Black was found dead, or more precisely, parts of Morris Black were found in garbage bags in Galveston Bay, having been dismembered with a degree of thoroughness that required considerable time and physical effort. Robert Durst was identified as a suspect almost immediately, fled before he could be arrested, was captured in Pennsylvania after being recognized while attempting to shoplift a sandwich from a grocery store despite having thousands of dollars in cash in his possession, and was returned to Texas to face charges of murder in connection with Black's death. The trial that followed in 2003 was one of the most extraordinary legal proceedings in Texas history, and its outcome was one that left virtually everyone who followed it with a profound and lingering sense of disbelief. Durst's defense team, led by attorney Dick DeGuerin, constructed an argument that Durst had shot Morris Black in self-defense during a struggle for a gun, that the shooting had been accidental or reactive rather than deliberate, and that the dismemberment of the body, conducted by Durst himself, a fact he acknowledged, had been the panicked response of a man who knew that given his history and his circumstances no one would believe the truth of what had happened. The jury, after deliberating for 5 hours, acquitted Robert Durst of murder. They found him guilty only of the lesser charge of evidence tampering related to the disposal of the body, for which he was sentenced to time served and was released from custody. The acquittal was met with widespread astonishment and generated extensive analysis of the Texas legal system, of the effectiveness of Durst's legal team, and of the degree to which wealth and access to skilled representation can produce outcomes in the criminal justice system that bear little relationship to the factual circumstances of a case. The final and ultimately fatal chapter of Robert Durst's legal history began with a documentary. In 2015, HBO broadcast a 6-part documentary series titled The Jinx: The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, directed by Andrew Uretsky, which examined the 3 deaths connected to Durst with a depth and a journalistic rigor that produced several remarkable developments, including the presentation of a handwritten note that Durst had sent to Susan Berman years before her death which, when compared to the cadaver note sent to the Beverly Hills Police Department, showed such striking similarities in handwriting and in the distinctive misspelling of the word Beverly as Beverly that even Durst, confronted with the comparison on camera, appeared to struggle to maintain his composure. The final episode of the documentary contained a moment that became one of the most discussed sequences in the history of true crime media. Durst, apparently believing that his microphone had been turned off as he left for a bathroom break, was recorded muttering to himself a sequence of words that began with what sounded like an acknowledgement that he had made mistakes and concluded with the phrase that became the defining quotation of the entire case. The recording was ambiguous in certain respects, and its admissibility and interpretation would become subjects of extensive legal argument, but its impact on public perception of Robert Durst was immediate and essentially irreversible. Robert Durst was arrested on March 14, 2015, in New Orleans, Louisiana, one day before the final episode of The Jinx was broadcast, on the basis of a warrant connected to the murder of Susan Berman in Los Angeles. The arrest was the product of years of investigative work by Los Angeles detectives who had never closed the Berman case and who had used the documentary process, including evidence that emerged from Durst's own participation in the film, to build a case they believed was finally sufficient to prosecute. Durst was held without bail and extradited to California, where he was charged with first-degree murder in connection with Berman's death, with prosecutors arguing that the murder had been committed to prevent Berman from cooperating with investigators looking into Kathy Durst's disappearance and that it therefore constituted a murder committed to prevent a witness from testifying, a special circumstance that made Durst eligible for the death penalty. The pretrial period extended for years, complicated by Durst's deteriorating health. He had been diagnosed with bladder cancer and underwent treatment while in custody, and by the extraordinary complexity of the legal issues involved in a case that incorporated evidence from 3 separate potential homicides spanning nearly 4 decades. The trial finally began in 2021, delayed further by the COVID-19 pandemic, and it produced a verdict of guilty on first-degree murder on September 17, 2021, Robert Durst's 78th birthday. Judge Mark Wyndham sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and in imposing the sentence noted the breadth and the duration of the conduct that the evidence had revealed and the particular cruelty of a crime committed against a woman who had been Durst's closest friend and who had, investigators believed, done him the profound favor of lying to protect him, only to be killed when that protection became a liability he could no longer afford to maintain. The Kathy Durst disappearance case was never formally closed with a criminal conviction, though New York investigators who examined the case in the years following Robert's arrest have expressed their belief that Kathy did not disappear voluntarily and that the circumstances of her disappearance were connected to her husband. Robert Durst died on January 10, 2022, at the California healthcare facility where he had been receiving treatment for his cancer, less than 4 months after his conviction, having never spent a single day of his life sentence in a general prison population. He was 78 years old, and he died as he had lived, insulated from the full weight of consequences by the combination of wealth, legal resources, and the simple biological fact of age that had defined his relationship with accountability for his entire adult life. Kathy Durst, Susan Berman, and Morris Black each died in circumstances connected to a man who walked free for decades while the families of those he was suspected of killing waited for a justice that arrived, in the one case where it arrived at all, only at the very end of a life lived almost entirely without it. Number 9, Gerard Schaefer, the Florida sheriff's deputy who used his badge and his authority to abduct, torture, and murder young women, and who was convicted of only 2 killings despite evidence suggesting he was responsible for the deaths of many more. Gerard John Schaefer Jr. was born on March 25, 1946, in Neenah, Wisconsin, and grew up in a household that relocated to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, during his childhood, settling into the kind of suburban Florida environment that in the post-war decades presented an image of sun-drenched normalcy that concealed, in many individual households, considerably darker realities. Schaefer was the eldest of 3 children raised by a father who was, by multiple accounts from people who knew the family, a cold and domineering man whose treatment of his son combined emotional cruelty with a withholding of affection so consistent and so complete that it left marks on Schaefer's psychological development that clinicians who later examined him described as foundational to the pathology he eventually expressed through violence. Schaefer was not, as a child or adolescent, outwardly threatening or obviously disturbed in ways that attracted professional attention or community concern. He was an unremarkable student, not particularly popular but not particularly isolated, someone who moved through the social landscape of his school and neighborhood without generating the kind of alarm that might have prompted intervention. Beneath the surface, however, he was nurturing a set of fantasies that were violent, misogynistic, and increasingly specific in their detail, fantasies involving the abduction, restraint, and murder of women that he had been developing since early adolescence and that he sustained and elaborated over years through a combination of written material, drawings, and eventually action. He attended Florida Atlantic University for a period and then pursued his ambition of working in law enforcement, an ambition that in retrospect carries a particular horror given what investigators later established about the uses to which he intended to put a badge and a uniform. He applied to the Broward County Sheriff's Office but was rejected, and he subsequently found employment as a teacher before eventually succeeding in his law enforcement ambitions by joining the Martin County Sheriff's Office in 1972, where he was hired as a deputy sheriff and given the authority, the uniform, and the official vehicle that he had been seeking. The people who worked with him at the Martin County Sheriff's Office would later describe him in terms that were remarkably consistent with the descriptions given of other killers in cases of this kind. He was regarded as competent enough in his duties, somewhat intense, perhaps a little odd in ways that colleagues attributed to personality quirks rather than anything more alarming, and entirely unremarkable as a law enforcement officer in the ways that his supervisors measured performance. Nothing about his conduct at work, in the early months of his employment, suggested to the people responsible for supervising him that they had hired a man who had already committed murders and who was actively using the tools of his position to identify and access new victims. The conduct that brought Schaefer to the attention of his supervisors for the first time occurred in July 1972, when he picked up 2 teenage girls who were hitchhiking, 17-year-old Pamela Wells and Nancy Trotter, while he was on duty in his patrol car. Rather than simply warning the girls about the dangers of hitchhiking as a responsible officer might have done, Schaefer drove them to a remote area of swampland, handcuffed them to trees, gagged them, and left them there while he went to handle a call, apparently intending to return and complete whatever he had planned for them. The girls managed to free themselves and reported the incident to the Martin County Sheriff's Office, and Schaefer was confronted by his supervisor, Sheriff Richard Crowder, who suspended him and subsequently fired him. The incident was referred for criminal prosecution, and Schaefer was charged with 2 counts of assault and false imprisonment, serious charges, but not charges that reflected what Schaefer had actually intended for those 2 young women, and not charges that resulted in any examination of whether this incident was an isolated aberration or evidence of a pattern that had already produced far graver consequences. He was released on bail pending trial on those charges, and in the months between his arrest for the Wells and Trotter incident and his eventual sentencing, Gerard Schaefer murdered 2 more young women. Susan Place was 18 years old and Georgia Jessup was 17 when they encountered Gerard Schaefer in September 1972. Both girls were from the Fort Lauderdale area, and both disappeared on September 27, 1972, after Susan's mother observed them leaving with a man she was able to describe in sufficient detail to be useful to investigators. Their remains were not discovered until the following year, in January 1973, buried in a remote area of Hutchinson Island on Florida's Treasure Coast, a location that was within the geographic territory Schaefer knew well from his time with the Martin County Sheriff's Office. The condition of the remains when they were found was consistent with the kind of violence that Schaefer's written materials, recovered later, described in elaborate and specific detail, and the forensic evidence gathered at the scene, combined with the description provided by Susan Place's mother, pointed investigators toward Schaefer with a directness that left little room for doubt about his responsibility for their deaths. He was arrested, charged with the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, and brought to trial in 1973 while already serving a prison sentence of 6 months that had been imposed for the assault and false imprisonment of Pamela Wells and Nancy Trotter. The trial for the murders of Place and Jessup was conducted in October 1973 before Judge D.C. Smith in St. Lucie County, Florida, and it produced verdicts of guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Schaefer was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences, which under the Florida law of that period meant that he would be eligible for parole consideration after serving a minimum term, a prospect that horrified the investigators and prosecutors who had worked the case and who were convinced that the 2 murders for which Schaefer had been convicted represented only a fraction of the violence he had actually committed. Their conviction on this point was not abstract. It was grounded in a substantial body of evidence that emerged during and after the investigation, evidence that pointed toward a number of other disappearances and deaths that bore the hallmarks of Schaefer's methods and that occurred in the geographic areas where he had lived and worked. The evidence took multiple forms, the most disturbing of which was a collection of written material and personal effects discovered at his mother's home after his arrest. The material found at the Schaefer family home was among the most disturbing bodies of evidence recovered in connection with any American serial killer case of the 20th century. Investigators found journals, stories, and detailed written accounts of abductions, tortures, and murders that went far beyond anything that could be attributed to fiction or fantasy. They were specific, procedural, and saturated with a level of detail that was consistent with the documentation of actual events rather than the products of imagination. They found personal items, jewelry, identification documents, teeth, that were later connected to women who had disappeared in Florida during the years Schaefer had been active, women whose cases had been investigated as missing persons incidents or unsolved homicides without any connection to Schaefer having been established at the time. The items and the written material together suggested a killer who had been operating for years before his arrest, who kept trophies from his victims, and who had documented his crimes in writing with a compulsiveness that spoke to the centrality of the violence to his psychological functioning. Estimates of the total number of victims attributed to Schaefer by investigators who examined the full scope of the evidence ranged widely, with some investigators suggesting the number could be as high as 30 or more, though the evidentiary basis for specific attributions varied significantly from case to case and the official conviction remained limited to the 2 murders for which he had been tried and found guilty. Schaefer conducted himself in prison in a manner that reflected both his intelligence and his profound inability to genuinely reckon with what he had done. He was litigious, filing numerous legal challenges to his conviction and sentence over the years, and he maintained correspondence with a wide range of people outside the prison, including journalists, true crime writers, and others interested in his case. He wrote extensively, producing material that he characterized as fiction but that people who read it found indistinguishable in tone and detail from the documented accounts of actual violence found at his mother's home. He gave interviews in which he denied responsibility for murders beyond the 2 convictions and presented himself as the victim of an overzealous prosecution that had refused to examine alternative explanations for the evidence. He was, by the assessment of the correctional staff and mental health professionals who encountered him during his incarceration, a man of genuine intelligence who deployed that intelligence entirely in the service of self-protection and self-presentation rather than any genuine engagement with the reality of what he had done to the people he had killed and to the families those people had left behind. The families of the women whose disappearances were connected to Schaefer, women like Carmen Marie Hollock, Elsie Farmer, Mary Briscolina, Elsie Jacoby, and a number of others whose cases investigators examined in the context of the evidence recovered from the Schaefer investigation, lived for years with the particular agony of unresolved cases, of knowing that the man in prison was almost certainly responsible for what had happened to their daughters and sisters and friends but being unable to obtain the formal legal acknowledgement of that responsibility that a conviction would have provided. The limitations of the physical evidence, the passage of time, and the damage done to potential evidence by Florida's climate and environment combined to make successful prosecution of additional cases effectively impossible, and the families were left with the investigators' conclusions and their own certainty, neither of which carried the weight of a verdict. Gerard Schaefer was murdered in his cell at Florida State Prison on December 3, 1995. He was 49 years old and had been serving his 2 life sentences for 22 years. His killer was a fellow inmate named Vincent Rivera, who stabbed Schaefer multiple times in an attack that killed him before correctional staff could intervene. Rivera was convicted of the murder and received an additional sentence. The circumstances of Schaefer's death generated relatively little public sympathy and considerable private satisfaction among the investigators, prosecutors, and victim family members who had spent years dealing with the reality of what he had done and the limitations of the justice that had been formally applied to him. His death closed the possibility of any further legal proceedings connected to his crimes, and the cases of the women whose disappearances were never formally resolved remained officially open even as the man most investigators believed responsible for them was gone. The legacy of the Gerard Schaefer case in the history of American law enforcement is centered on 2 deeply uncomfortable lessons that the case illustrated with particular clarity. The first is about the specific danger posed by killers who operate within law enforcement or who use the symbols and authority of law enforcement to facilitate access to victims. Schaefer's badge gave him a legitimacy and an access that a civilian predator would not have had, and the trust that young women in that era were conditioned to place in uniformed authority figures made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of approach he used with Pamela Wells and Nancy Trotter and almost certainly with other victims before and after them. The second lesson is about the consequences of inadequate information sharing and investigative coordination in an era before the computerized databases and interagency communication systems that modern law enforcement takes for granted. The disappearances that may be connected to Schaefer occurred across multiple jurisdictions in a period when the connections between cases in different counties or different parts of the state were not easily identified, and the absence of those connections allowed a man who had already committed murders to be employed as a law enforcement officer and to continue his violence under the cover that employment provided. Susan Place and Georgia Jessup were 18 and 17 years old when Gerard Schaefer murdered them. They were young women at the beginning of their lives, and they encountered a man who was wearing a badge and who had decided, long before they met him, that their lives were his to take. Number 10. Susan Smith, the South Carolina mother who strapped her 2 small sons into their car seats, rolled the car into a lake, and then stood before television cameras and begged a fictional carjacker to bring her children home. Susan Vaughn was born on September 26, 1971, in Union, South Carolina, a small mill town in the northwestern part of the state where everyone knew everyone and where the social fabric was woven tightly enough that the events of October 1994 would leave a tear in it that the community never fully repaired. Her childhood was defined by instability and trauma in ways that mental health professionals who later examined her documented with considerable care, not as an excuse for what she eventually did but as context for the psychological landscape she inhabited as an adult. Her parents divorced when she was 6 years old, and her father, Harry Vaughn, died by suicide shortly afterward, a loss so sudden and so devastating that its effects on Susan's developing psychology were, by the assessment of every clinician who examined her, profound and lasting. Her mother Linda remarried a man named Beverly Russell, and the household that Susan grew up in thereafter was one that presented an acceptable face to the community of Union while harboring a reality considerably darker. Beverly Russell, who was a prominent local figure involved in Republican Party politics and the Christian Coalition, began sexually abusing Susan when she was a teenager, an abuse that continued for years and that Susan did not disclose publicly until after the events that made her name known across the country. She struggled with depression from an early age, made at least 1 suicide attempt as a teenager, and carried into adulthood a set of psychological wounds that had never been adequately treated and that shaped her responses to stress, rejection, and emotional pain in ways that would ultimately prove catastrophic. She married David Smith in 1991, a young man from Union whom she had dated through high school, and the marriage produced 2 sons, Michael Daniel Smith, born on October 10, 1991, and Alexander Tyler Smith, born on August 5, 1993. Michael was 3 years old and Alexander was 14 months old in October 1994. By that point the marriage between Susan and David had deteriorated significantly. They had separated, reconciled, and separated again, caught in the cycle of dysfunction that characterizes many relationships between two young people who married too quickly and discovered too late that the foundation was not what either of them had believed it to be. Susan had become involved with a wealthy local man named Tom Findley, the son of the owner of the textile company where she worked, and the relationship with Findley had become the emotional center of her life in the months leading up to the murders, the thing she wanted most and that she had organized her hopes and her sense of the future around. In late October 1994, Findley sent Susan a letter in which he ended the relationship, citing among his reasons his unwillingness to take on the responsibilities of a ready-made family. He did not want to be a stepfather, he said, and the children were a complicating factor that made a future with Susan impossible on the terms she was seeking. The letter arrived days before the murders, and investigators who later examined the timeline of Susan Smith's state of mind in the final days before she killed her sons identified the receipt of that letter as a critical precipitating event, though the full psychological picture was considerably more complex than a single rejection producing a single catastrophic response. On the night of October 25, 1994, Susan Smith drove to John D. Long Lake, a small body of water located approximately 9 miles outside Union on a quiet rural road, with Michael and Alexander strapped into their car seats in the back of her burgundy Mazda Protégé. What happened at the lake in the darkness of that October evening is known from Susan's own eventual confession, from the forensic evidence gathered by investigators, and from the physical reconstruction of events that investigators conducted in the days following the discovery of the car and the children. Susan stopped the car at the boat ramp at John D. Long Lake, got out, released the parking brake, and allowed the car to roll forward into the water. The car entered the lake and sank, taking Michael and Alexander with it, still strapped into their car seats, still alive as the water rose around them, in a manner so horrifying that the rescue divers who eventually recovered the car and the children described the experience as one that stayed with them for the rest of their professional lives. Susan stood at the edge of the lake and watched the car sink. She then drove to a nearby house, knocked on the door in a state of apparent distress, and told the occupants that a black man had carjacked her vehicle with her children inside and had driven away. She repeated this story to the Union County Sheriff's Office when deputies arrived, and she elaborated it into a specific and detailed account. The carjacker had been a black man in his late 20s or early 30s, wearing a plaid shirt and a knit cap, who had forced her out of the car at a stoplight and driven away with her sons still in the back seat. The account Susan Smith gave to law enforcement that night set in motion one of the most intensive and emotionally charged missing children investigations in American history, and it did so on the basis of a lie so destructive in its specific details that its consequences extended far beyond the deaths of Michael and Alexander to inflict a particular harm on the African American community of Union and the surrounding area that deserves explicit acknowledgement. Susan Smith had not simply invented a carjacker, she had invented a black carjacker, and in doing so she had deployed one of the most enduring and most damaging racist tropes in American criminal history, the false accusation of black male criminality that had been used for generations to justify violence, discrimination, and the denial of basic rights to black Americans. The description she gave was specific enough to prompt law enforcement to stop and question black men throughout Union County in the days that followed, and the community of black residents in Union experienced the investigation not simply as a search for a missing perpetrator but as an environment of heightened suspicion and racial profiling directed at them personally, a consequence of Susan Smith's decision to construct her alibi around a stereotype that she knew would be immediately credible to white law enforcement in a small South Carolina town. The investigation was led by Union County Sheriff Howard Wells, a man who would later be widely praised for the manner in which he conducted the 9-day period between Susan's initial report and her eventual confession, a period during which Wells managed the extraordinary tension between the public search for the missing children, the growing private suspicion among investigators that Susan's account was not what it appeared to be, and the need to maintain a relationship with Susan that would allow investigators to continue gathering information without prematurely closing off the possibility of obtaining a confession. Wells was assisted by agents from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division and by the FBI, who joined the investigation given the apparent interstate dimension of the alleged carjacking. The national media coverage was immediate and overwhelming, the story of two small children abducted by a carjacker in rural South Carolina generated the kind of round-the-clock attention that missing children cases involving sympathetic victims and a clear villain tend to produce, and Susan Smith became a familiar face on television screens across the country, appearing at press conferences and in interviews to plead for the return of her sons with a display of maternal anguish that the watching public found deeply moving. The inconsistencies in Susan's account began accumulating almost immediately, though their significance was not always apparent in real time. The stoplight where Susan claimed the carjacking had occurred was, investigators established, a stoplight that operated on a sensor system and would not have been red at the time Susan said she was stopped there. There was no traffic that would have triggered the sensor, meaning the light would have been green. The description of the carjacker was general enough to match a significant proportion of the population Susan had described, but witnesses who had been in the area at the relevant time reported seeing nothing consistent with a carjacking. And Susan herself, in the numerous interviews and interactions she had with investigators over the 9 days of the search, displayed a pattern of behavior and emotional expression that experienced investigators found increasingly difficult to reconcile with the account she was giving. She was asked repeatedly to take a polygraph examination, and she agreed to do so, and the results of the examination indicated deception, though polygraph results were not admissible in court and could not on their own form the basis of an arrest. Sheriff Wells, operating with the patience and the strategic precision that would define his handling of the entire investigation, continued meeting with Susan regularly, maintaining the relationship, and waiting for the moment that his instincts told him was coming. On November 3, 1994, 9 days after the alleged carjacking, Sheriff Wells sat down with Susan Smith for what would be their final interview before her confession, and in the course of that conversation he told her, with a directness and a compassion that were not contradictory in his handling of it, that he did not believe her account, that he believed she knew where her children were, and that he needed her to tell him the truth. What followed was a confession that lasted several hours and that Wells described afterward as one of the most difficult experiences of his professional life. Susan Smith told him what she had done, where the car was, and that Michael and Alexander were still inside it. She was taken into custody, and divers were sent to John D. Long Lake, where they located the Mazda Protégé in approximately 18 feet of water and recovered the bodies of Michael and Alexander Smith, still in their car seats, 9 days after their mother had rolled them into the lake and walked away. The arrest of Susan Smith and the revelation that the carjacker she had described had never existed produced a reaction in Union and across the country that was complex, intense, and in some respects deeply revealing about the social and racial dynamics that the case had exposed. The African American community's response incorporated both grief for the children and a legitimate anger about the manner in which a false racial accusation had been deployed and had been immediately and uncritically accepted, an anger that found expression in public statements and in the subsequent analysis of the case by civil rights advocates and scholars who used it as a case study in the persistence of racial stereotyping in American criminal proceedings. The white community of Union responded with a grief and a sense of betrayal that was genuine and profound. These were children who had been known and seen in the community, a mother who had been held and comforted and prayed for by neighbors who now had to reckon with what she had done. And the national media, which had devoted 9 days of continuous coverage to the search for a carjacker who did not exist, faced its own reckoning about the speed and the completeness with which it had accepted and amplified a narrative constructed around a racial stereotype without subjecting that narrative to the skepticism that responsible journalism requires. Susan Smith was charged with 2 counts of murder and held without bail pending trial. The prosecution was led by solicitor Tommy Pope, who sought the death penalty, and the defense was led by attorneys David Bruck and Judith Clark, who would later become known for their work in high-profile capital defense cases involving defendants with significant histories of trauma and mental illness. The trial took place in July 1995 in Union County, and it lasted approximately 2 weeks. The prosecution presented the physical evidence, the forensic reconstruction of events at the lake, the timeline of Susan's movements on the night of October 25th, the confession she had given to Sheriff Wells, and argued that the murders had been deliberate and premeditated acts committed by a woman who had decided that her children represented an obstacle to the romantic future she wanted and who had removed that obstacle with a cold-bloodedness that the evidence of 9 days of public Lying amply demonstrated. The defense presented extensive evidence of Susan's psychological history, the suicide of her father, the sexual abuse by her stepfather, the depression and the suicide attempts and the inadequately treated mental illness, and argued that Susan had been in a state of profound psychological crisis on the night of the murders, that she had not acted with the deliberateness that premeditated murder required, and that the death penalty was a disproportionate response to the actions of a deeply damaged and mentally ill young woman. Beverly Russell, Susan's stepfather, testified during the penalty phase of the trial and publicly acknowledged for the first time that he had sexually abused Susan during her teenage years, a disclosure that was both deeply significant for its content and deeply complicated in its context. It was offered as mitigation, as an explanation for the psychological damage that had contributed to what Susan had done, and it was received by the public and by the legal commentators who analyzed it with the full complexity that such a disclosure in such circumstances inevitably generates. The jury, after deliberating for approximately 2.5 hours, returned verdicts of guilty on both counts of murder. In the penalty phase, the same jury deliberated for approximately 30 minutes before returning a recommendation of life imprisonment rather than death, a recommendation that Judge William Howard followed in imposing sentence. Susan Smith was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years, meaning she would first become eligible for parole consideration in 2025. Susan Smith has been incarcerated at the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina, since her sentencing, and her time in prison has not been without incident. She was disciplined on multiple occasions in the early years of her incarceration for inappropriate relationships with correctional officers, incidents that generated additional media coverage and that reinforced, for many observers, the assessment of her as a person whose judgment and impulse control remained profoundly compromised. She has given limited interviews over the years, and the question of her eventual parole eligibility has generated ongoing discussion in South Carolina and in the broader true crime community, a discussion that intensified as the 2025 eligibility date approached. David Smith, who divorced Susan after the murders and who has remarried and rebuilt his life with considerable determination and public dignity, has been consistent in his opposition to any possibility of Susan's parole and has spoken publicly about the permanent nature of the loss he experienced and the impossibility of any outcome in the legal system that adequately reflects what was taken from him. Michael Smith was 3 years old when he died. Alexander Smith was 14 months old. They had names and personalities and the specific, irreplaceable individuality of small children who are just becoming themselves, and they died strapped into their car seats in the back of a sinking car on a dark October night in South Carolina, in a manner that no child should ever have to die, and for a reason that no child should ever have to be a reason for anything at all.